Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know, and allows us to keep creating these deep dives into the unexplained. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference, and if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. If this is your first time here and you're enjoying the content, consider subscribing. It means everything. A huge thank you to Stuart for suggesting tonight's topic. This is one of those stories that gets under your skin, not because of what happened, but because of what should not have been possible. Sometimes the most disturbing encounters are not with lights in the sky. They're with people who should not exist. There are cases in UFO research that defy simple categorization. Some involve physical evidence, others involve mass sightings. But there's a third category, quieter and more personal, that involves something far stranger. Contact after the encounter. Not from investigators, not from journalists, but from individuals who claim to represent authority while providing no evidence of it. Individuals whose presence feels staged, whose words feel scripted, and whose very existence leaves no trace once they're gone. This is the story of a man who called himself Indrid Cold, a man who appeared after a UFO sighting in rural North Carolina, a man who asked questions he already seemed to know the answers to, a man who spoke with the detachment of someone reading from a script they didn't write, and then, just as suddenly as he arrived, he vanished. No records, no follow-up, no proof he was ever real. Who was Indrid Cold? And more importantly, what was he? This case sits at a crossroads. It connects the classic Men in Black phenomena of the 1950s with the modern era of UFO disclosure. It involves a credible witness who never sought fame. It includes details that resist rational explanation while avoiding the sensational, and at its centre stands a figure who may not have been a figure at all, but rather something else, something that understood how to wear a human face but hadn't quite mastered what goes on behind it. Chapter 1. The encounter that changed everything. To understand the man who called himself Indrid Cold, we first have to understand the event that preceded him. We need to understand not just what happened, but what it felt like. Because this story is not about lights in the sky. It's about what happens when those lights decide to come closer. January 2007. Rural North Carolina. The landscape outside Fayetteville is flat and quiet. It's the kind of place where the night sky spreads wide and uninterrupted, where the only lights come from scattered farmhouses and the occasional passing car on distant roads. The air in January carries a particular kind of cold, the damp chill that seeps through clothing and settles into bones. Chris Bledsoe was not someone looking for attention. He was a businessman, a family man, living a relatively ordinary life in the quiet farmland that stretched for miles in every direction. He had no history of UFO interest, no background in conspiracy theories, no reason to fabricate what was about to happen. His life was structured around the normal concerns of a man in his position: business dealings, family obligations, the small daily rhythms that make up a life. He was by all accounts grounded, practical, not the type to see things that weren't there. On a cold evening in mid-January, Bledsoe and several family members decided to go fishing along the Cape Fear River. It was supposed to be a simple outing, a chance to relax, a break from the stresses that had been building in his professional life. The river at that time of year runs dark and cold, reflecting what little light reaches it from the winter sky. They set up their fishing gear as the sun began to set. The temperature was dropping. The kind of evening where you can see your breath, where sound carries differently in the cold air. Everything was normal, routine, the kind of peaceful evening that happens 1,000 times across the country without incident. What happened instead would alter the trajectory of his entire existence. According to Bledsoe's account, the first indication that something was wrong came not from sight, but from feeling. A change in the atmosphere, a pressure that seemed to build without source. The kind of sensation you might get before a thunderstorm, except there were no clouds, no wind, just a sudden, inexplicable tension in the air itself. And then they saw the lights, Not distant points, not airplanes, not helicopters or drones or any conventional aircraft. These were large, structured objects moving in ways that defied conventional explanation. They appeared over the tree line, silent at first, massive in scale. The light they emitted was unlike anything from a normal source. It didn't scatter or diffuse the way artificial light does. It seemed almost solid, as though the light itself had substance. They hovered, not like helicopters, which create visible disturbance in the air but with absolute stillness. And then they moved. Not gradually, not with the physics of objects bound by inertia and mass, but instantaneously. One moment stationary, the next moment elsewhere, with no transition between positions. Bledsoe described the experience as overwhelming, not just visually but emotionally. He felt drawn to the objects, compelled, as though something was communicating with him on a level beyond language, beyond conscious thought. It was a feeling of being seen, recognized, acknowledged by something vast and incomprehensible. His son was with him, his father, other family members, they all saw it. This was not a solitary experience that could be dismissed as hallucination or misperception. Multiple witnesses, multiple perspectives, all describing the same impossible thing. The encounter lasted hours. Time seemed to behave strangely. Moments that felt like minutes stretched into longer periods. Other spans of time seemed to compress or disappear entirely. It's a common element in high strangeness cases, this distortion of temporal perception, as though whatever was happening existed partially outside the normal flow of time. At one point, according to Bledsoe's account, the objects came closer, close enough that he could see detail, structure. The light didn't illuminate like a searchlight or spotlight. It simply existed, emanating from surfaces that seemed to shift and reconfigure. He described feeling paralyzed, not physically restrained, but unable to move, as though his body had forgotten how to respond to commands from his mind. And then there was the emotional component, an overwhelming sense of awe mixed with terror, the recognition that he was in the presence of something so far beyond human understanding that the normal categories of experience no longer applied. It was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. When the encounter finally ended, when the objects departed as suddenly and silently as they had arrived, Bledsoe found himself sitting on the cold ground, disoriented and emotionally shattered. His family members were similarly affected. Some were crying. Others sat in stunned silence. All of them knew they had witnessed something that would change them forever. The drive home was quiet. What do you say after experiencing something like that? How do you process an encounter that defies every framework you've built for understanding reality? Bledsoe couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the lights, felt the presence. The experience had opened. Something in his mind, a door that couldn't be closed. He lay in the darkness of his bedroom, listening to the ordinary sounds of his house, and feeling profoundly displaced from the normal world. He had no framework for what he had witnessed, no explanation that made sense. He knew what he had seen was real with a certainty that bypassed doubt, but that certainty brought no comfort, because if it was real, then everything he thought he understood about the world was incomplete. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was real. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he lay awake that night, was that the encounter was not over. It was only beginning. Because 3 days later, someone knocked on his door. Someone who should not have known what happened. Someone who had no reason to be there. Someone who called himself Indrid Cold. Chapter 2. The Visitor Arrives. 3 days after the sighting, Chris Bledsoe was trying to return to normal life. Trying and failing. He had told a few close friends about the encounter. Their reactions ranged from concern to polite skepticism. Some suggested he see a professional. Others changed the subject quickly, uncomfortable with territory that challenged their worldview. It was an isolating experience, to have witnessed something profound and find no one willing to engage with it seriously. He was in his living room when he heard the knock. It was mid-afternoon. the kind of time when unexpected visitors are unusual. The knock itself was formal. 3 precise raps. Not the casual knock of a friend or neighbour. Something more official. When Bledsoe opened the door, he found a man standing on his porch. The first thing he noticed was the suit. It was dark, nearly black, but with a faint sheen that suggested synthetic material rather than quality wool. The cut was oddly generic, as though ordered from a catalogue that hadn't updated its designs in decades. Not quite contemporary, not quite vintage, just slightly wrong in a way that was hard to articulate. The man himself was unremarkable in appearance, average height, average build. His face had the kind of generic quality that makes it difficult to recall specific features. Later, when Bledsoe tried to describe him to others, he found himself struggling. Was his hair brown or dark blonde? Were his eyes blue or grey? The details seemed to slip away even as he tried to grasp them. But the expression was unforgettable. Blank. Neutral. Not the way someone looks when they're trying to appear neutral, but genuinely empty of affect. His face was like a default setting. No smile lines, no furrows from concentration or worry. Just smooth, unmarked neutrality. The man introduced himself. "My name is Indrid Cold," he said. His voice was measured, each word given equal weight and spacing. There was no regional accent, no particular inflection, just words delivered with mechanical precision. "I represent a government agency," he continued. "I would like to ask you some questions about the incident that occurred 3 days ago." He did not specify which agency. He offered no identification, no badge, no credentials of any kind. He simply stood there, waiting for Bledsoe's response with that same blank expression. There was something about his demeanour that suggested authority. Not aggressive authority, the kind that demands compliance, but the subtler kind that comes from bureaucratic power. The kind that doesn't need to justify itself because it operates from a position of assumed legitimacy. Bledsoe hesitated. Every instinct told him something was off. But there was also a part of him that wanted answers. If this man represented the government, perhaps there was an explanation. Perhaps what he had witnessed was part of some classified program. Perhaps there was a rational framework after all. "How did you know about the incident?" Bledsoe asked. Indrid Cold's expression didn't change. "We monitor unusual aerial phenomena," he said. "May I come inside?" The phrasing was strange, formal to the point of being antiquated, and the way he asked permission felt rehearsed, as though he had been taught that this was the appropriate protocol but didn't understand the social nuance behind it. Bledsoe stepped aside and let him in. Indrid Cold entered with precise movements. He didn't glance around the room the way a normal visitor would, taking in the space and orienting himself. He simply walked to the nearest chair and sat down. His posture was rigid, perfectly vertical, hands placed symmetrically on his knees. "Please sit," he said to Bledsoe, even though it was Bledsoe's own living room. Bledsoe sat. What followed was one of the strangest interviews Bledsoe had ever experienced. Indrid Cold began asking questions. The questions themselves were straightforward enough. What time had the encounter occurred? How many objects had he seen? What had he felt during the experience? Had anyone else witnessed it? But the delivery was what made it strange. Each question was asked in the same measured tone. There was no variation in pitch or rhythm, no emphasis on certain words, just a flat mechanical recitation of questions that felt like they were being read from a list. And there was no follow-up. In a normal conversation, when someone asks a question and receives an answer, they respond to that answer. They might ask for clarification. They might express surprise or interest. They might pivot to a related question based on what they've learned. Indrid Cold did none of this. He asked a question. Bledsoe answered. Cold moved to the next question. There was no sense of an actual conversation taking place. It was more like a form being filled out, data being collected without context or comprehension. Bledsoe found himself increasingly unsettled. The man across from him didn't react to anything he said, didn't nod in understanding, didn't write anything down. He simply listened with that blank expression. as though recording the information through some internal process that required no external notation. At one point, Bledsoe attempted to ask his own questions. "Which agency do you work for exactly?" Indrid Cold paused for a fraction of a second as though processing the query. "That is not relevant to this interview," he said. "Why are you interested in what I saw?" Another pause. "We gather data on unexplained phenomena." The answers were evasive without being obviously deceptive. They provided just enough information to seem like responses while revealing nothing substantive. And there was something else Bledsoe noticed. Indrid Cold never blinked. Not once during the entire conversation. His eyes remained fixed, unmoving, locked onto Bledsoe with an intensity that felt more like observation than human attention. The interview lasted roughly 30 minutes. Toward the end, Cold asked a question that made Bledsoe's skin prickle. "Did the objects communicate with you?" Bledsoe hadn't mentioned anything about communication. He had described seeing lights, feeling overwhelmed, but he hadn't talked about the sense of contact, of being acknowledged by something intelligent. "What makes you think they communicated?" Bledsoe asked carefully. "It is a standard question," Cold replied, but the timing of it, the specificity suggested otherwise. When the questions finally ended, Indrid Cold stood up with the same precise movements he had used to sit down. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "Will someone be in touch?" Bledsoe asked. "Is there going to be an investigation?" "That will be determined through appropriate channels," Cold said. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside without looking back. Bledsoe followed him to the porch, wanting to ask more questions, wanting some kind of concrete information about what happened next. But when he reached the door, Indrid Cold was already gone. Not walking down the driveway, not getting into a car, just gone. The driveway was empty, the street was quiet. It was as though the man had simply ceased to exist the moment he stepped off the porch. Bledsoe stood there in the cold afternoon air, staring at the empty space where a man had been moments before, and felt a creeping dread settle over him. No business card, no contact information, no mention of when or if anyone would return. He went back inside and sat down in the same chair where he had been questioned. The room felt normal again. The ordinary afternoon light filtered through the windows. The familiar sounds of his house resumed their regular patterns, but nothing felt normal anymore. Chapter 3. Something Feels Wrong. It wasn't until after Indrid Cold left that the full weight of the encounter began to settle on Chris Bledsoe. In the immediate aftermath, he had been too focused on answering questions, too caught up in the moment to fully process what was happening. But now, in the silence of his own living room, the strangeness of it crystallized. He had been visited by a man claiming to represent the government. But which part of the government? What agency? And why had he offered no proof of his identity? Bledsoe had dealt with government officials before. Business permits, tax issues, the routine interactions of running a company, and in every single instance credentials had been presented. Identification had been offered. There was always a paper trail, a business card, some physical evidence that the interaction had occurred. In any legitimate investigation, this is standard protocol. Law enforcement officers show their badges. Federal agents present identification. Even survey takers carry laminated credentials. It's how trust is established. It's how authority is verified. Indrid Cold had provided nothing. Bledsoe began replaying the conversation in his mind. The more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Details that had seemed merely odd in the moment now appeared profoundly wrong. Indrid Cold's speech had been oddly formal, almost archaic in its construction. He had said things like, "May I come inside?" instead of "Can I come in?" He had used phrases like, "That will be determined through appropriate channels," when a normal person might have just said, "I don't know," or "I'll have to check." It was the kind of language you might find in an old government manual, bureaucratic phrasing from a different era. As though someone had learned how officials were supposed to speak, but was working from outdated source material. He didn't use contractions, didn't say "I'm," or "that's," or "we're." Every word was fully enunciated, every sentence complete and formal. It was technically correct English, but it lacked the natural flow and rhythm of actual human speech. and there had been no small talk, none at all. Normal human interactions, even formal ones, include some element of casual communication, a comment about the weather, an apology for the intrusion, some acknowledgement of the social context. Indrid Cold had offered nothing. No pleasantries, no moments of casual human interaction. It was as though he had been programmed to ask specific questions and nothing more. Any deviation from that program resulted in those strange pauses, those moments where he seemed to be processing before delivering his next scripted line. His movements too had felt rehearsed. Bledsoe remembered how Cold had sat, perfectly rigid, spine straight, hands placed with geometric precision on his knees. He hadn't shifted position once during the entire conversation, hadn't crossed his legs, hadn't adjusted his posture. He had simply maintained that same rigid position as though locked into place, and the eye contact, that unblinking stare. In normal conversation, people's eyes move. They glance away briefly. They blink. They show the unconscious movements that come with thinking and processing. Indrid Cold's eyes had remained fixed, unmoving, locked onto Bledsoe with an intensity that suggested observation rather than engagement. It was like being watched by a camera that happened to be shaped like a person. There was also the matter of his name, Indrid Cold. Bledsoe repeated it to himself, letting the syllables roll around in his mind. It didn't sound like a real name. It sounded constructed, artificial, like a name someone might use if they needed a name but didn't understand how names actually worked. Indrid is traditionally a Scandinavian name, most commonly given to women. For a man to have that name was unusual but not impossible. But paired with Cold as a surname, it took on an almost allegorical quality. Cold, emotionless, detached, distant. Was it a real name, or was it a designation? A code that meant something specific within whatever system Indrid Cold operated from? Bledsoe tried to recall if Cold had shown any personal characteristics at all, any detail that might indicate he was an actual person with an actual life. But there was nothing. No wedding ring, no watch, no pen in his pocket, no phone clipped to his belt, nothing to suggest a life beyond this single interaction. It was as though Indrid Cold had been assembled specifically for this encounter and would be disassembled once it was complete. And there was something else. Something Bledsoe couldn't quite articulate but felt deeply in his gut. Indrid Cold's presence had felt wrong, not threatening in an aggressive way but fundamentally off. Like watching an actor play a role they didn't fully understand. Someone going through the motions of being human without grasping what being human actually means. The uncanny valley, that's what psychologists call it. The sense of wrongness we feel when something appears almost human but isn't quite right. A mannequin in dim light. A very realistic robot. Something that mimics humanity closely enough to trigger our social recognition systems but not quite perfectly enough to be convincing. Indrid Cold had existed in that valley, close enough to human to pass at first glance. But upon reflection, upon careful consideration of all the small details, fundamentally wrong. Bledsoe stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon was peaceful. His neighbours' houses sat quiet in the fading light. Cars passed on the distant road. Everything was normal. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been interviewed by something that was only pretending to be a person, and that pretense had not been entirely successful. Chapter 4. Knowledge He Shouldn't Have. In the weeks following the visit, Chris Bledsoe tried to return to his normal life. He went to work. He interacted with his family. He attempted to file away the experience as just another strange element of an already strange situation. But he couldn't, because strange things kept happening. Small things at first, synchronicities that could be dismissed as coincidence. He would think about the encounter and the phone would ring. He would decide to research UFO phenomena online, and his internet would disconnect. His electronics began behaving erratically, computers freezing, phones dropping calls, the television switching channels on its own. These could all be explained rationally. Technology malfunctions, random chance, confirmation bias. But the frequency and timing of these events created a pattern that was hard to ignore. And then there were the predictions. During their conversation, Ingrid Cold had made certain statements. At the time, Bledsoe hadn't paid much attention to them. They had seemed like generic observations, vague comments that could apply to almost anyone. But then those statements started coming true. Cold had mentioned that Bledsoe would face professional difficulties in the coming months. At the time, Bledsoe's business was stable. There was no indication of problems, but within weeks, deals began falling through. Clients became unreachable. Financial pressures mounted in ways that seemed to come from nowhere. Cold had mentioned that Bledsoe would have difficulty sleeping. Another generic statement that could apply to almost anyone under stress. But Bledsoe began experiencing severe insomnia. Not the normal kind where you have trouble falling asleep. This was different. He would lie awake for hours, feeling completely alert, as though sleep itself had become impossible. And when he did finally drift off, his dreams were vivid and disturbing. Cold had asked if Bledsoe would be speaking to researchers about his experience. At the time, Bledsoe had no plans to do so, but within a month, he found himself being contacted by UFO investigators who had somehow learned about his encounter. People he had never met, people who claimed to have heard about his experience through channels he couldn't identify. How had they known? He had told only a few close friends. He had not filed any reports. He had not contacted any organizations, and yet researchers were showing up, asking questions, wanting details. It was as though his experience had been logged somewhere, catalogued in some system that certain people had access to, a system that existed outside official channels. But the most disturbing prediction was the most specific. During their conversation, Cold had made an odd comment about Bledsoe's family. He had said, almost casually, "Your son will also have encounters." At the time, Bledsoe hadn't known how to respond to that. It wasn't framed as a question. It was stated as a fact, as though Cold was not predicting the future, but reading from a timeline that had already been written. 6 weeks later, Bledsoe's son reported seeing lights identical to the ones they had witnessed together. But this time, his son was alone. And this time, the encounter was even closer, more intense, more personally directed. How could Ingrid Cold have known that would happen? How could he have predicted specific future events in the lives of people he had never met before? If Cold was simply a government investigator, his knowledge made no sense. There had been no surveillance in place before the first encounter. No reason for any agency to be monitoring the Bledsoe family. They were ordinary citizens living ordinary lives. Unless the government had been monitoring them before the encounter, unless they had known something was going to happen, unless the UFO phenomenon itself was connected to some kind of predictive system that allowed authorities to anticipate sightings before they occurred. That possibility was disturbing enough. But there was another interpretation, one that Bledsoe tried not to think about but couldn't entirely dismiss. What if Ingrid Cold wasn't there to gather information? What if he was there to confirm what he already knew? Not because he had access to surveillance systems or classified databases, but because he was part of the same phenomenon as the lights themselves. What if he hadn't been sent to investigate a UFO encounter? What if he was part of the UFO encounter, an extension of whatever intelligence had appeared in the sky 3 days earlier? That would explain his impossible knowledge. It would explain why he spoke as though reading from a script. It would explain the lack of credentials, the absence of records, the strange behaviour. Because he wasn't a government agent at all. He was something else. Something that understood it needed to appear as a government agent, but didn't quite know how to execute that appearance convincingly. Bledsoe kept these thoughts to himself. He knew how they sounded. Paranoid, conspiratorial, the kind of thinking that gets people dismissed as unstable. But he also couldn't ignore what he had experienced. The encounter was real. Ingrid Cold was real. The predictions that came true were real. And somewhere in that reality was a truth that resisted. Conventional explanation. This is where the encounter shifts from strange to genuinely unsettling. Because if Ingrid Cold was simply an investigator, his knowledge could potentially be explained. Maybe he had conducted surveillance. Maybe he had interviewed others who were present. Maybe he had access to classified monitoring systems that tracked UFO phenomena. But if he wasn't an investigator, if he was something else entirely, then his knowledge suggests something far more disturbing. That he wasn't there to gather information. He was there to let Bledsoe know he was being watched, to establish that the encounter was not over, to make it clear that whatever had appeared in the sky that night had not simply observed and left. It had marked him, and it would be back. Chapter 5. The Men in Black Parallel. The story of Indrid Cold does not exist in isolation. It is part of a much larger, much older pattern. A pattern that stretches back to the earliest days of modern UFO research and continues into the present day. A pattern that involves strange visitors who appear after sightings and leave witnesses more confused than enlightened. They are called the Men in Black. The phenomenon has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture that the term itself has lost much of its original strangeness. Movies and television shows have turned the Men in Black into government agents, secret organisation members, even aliens disguised as humans. The Hollywood version is slick, professional, equipped with advanced technology. But the original reports, the ones that emerged in the 1950s and 60s, describe something far stranger and more unsettling. Something that fits the Indrid Cold encounter with disturbing precision. The first widely documented case involved a man named Albert Bender. In 1953, Bender was running a UFO research organisation called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He was investigating sightings, collecting data, building a network of researchers and witnesses, and then one day 3 men in dark suits showed up at his door. According to Bender's account, these men knew details about his research that should have been private. They spoke in strange, formal language. They made veiled threats about what would happen if he continued his investigations. And then they left, vanishing as mysteriously as they had arrived. Bender was terrified. He shut down his organisation, he stopped researching UFOs entirely, and for years he refused to discuss what had happened. When he finally did write about the encounter, his description of the visitors was deeply unsettling. They weren't quite human, he suggested. They moved strangely. Their voices sounded wrong. Their eyes seemed to look through him rather than at him, and their presence triggered a visceral fear response that went beyond normal intimidation. In the decades that followed, similar reports multiplied. UFO witnesses across the country began describing visits from strange men in dark suits who showed up unannounced in the days or weeks following sightings. The pattern was remarkably consistent. They arrived unannounced, usually within days of a UFO encounter. No phone calls beforehand, no appointments scheduled, they simply appeared. They claimed to represent government agencies but provided no credentials. Sometimes they flashed badges too quickly to examine. Other times they offered nothing at all. They operated from assumed authority without proving that authority existed. They asked questions in a detached, emotionless manner. Witnesses described their speech as robotic, mechanical, as though reciting from a script. The conversations felt rehearsed, artificial, lacking the natural flow of human interaction. They displayed behaviours that seemed slightly out of sync with normal human interaction. Some reports described men in black who didn't seem to understand how doors worked, reaching for handles in awkward ways. Others mentioned visitors who sat too rigidly, moved too precisely, spoke in patterns that felt programmed rather than spontaneous. They wore clothing that seemed slightly out of date, dark suits that looked like they came from an earlier era, hats that hadn't been fashionable in decades, ties and shoes that suggested someone's idea of how authority figures should dress based on outdated information. And then they vanished, leaving no trace of their existence. No one could track them back to any agency. No one could verify their identities. They existed only in the moment of encounter, and then dissolved back into whatever void they had emerged from. Some witnesses reported even stranger details. Men in black who seemed confused by ordinary objects, who asked bizarre questions about mundane things, who appeared to be learning about human culture in real time. One famous account from the 1960s involved a woman who offered her men in black visitors a glass of water. According to her report, They stared at the glasses with apparent confusion before attempting to drink. One of them tried to consume the water by holding the glass against his face without opening his mouth, as though he understood the concept of drinking but not the mechanism. These details could be dismissed as embellishment, memory distortion, the tendency of stories to become more elaborate with each retelling, but the consistency across multiple reports from witnesses who had no contact with each other is harder to explain, and Indrid Cold fits this pattern perfectly. He arrived 3 days after a UFO sighting. He claimed government affiliation without providing proof. His demeanour was emotionless and his speech was oddly formal. He asked questions as though following a script. He displayed knowledge he shouldn't have possessed, and then he vanished without a trace. But there's one key difference between Indrid Cold and the classic Men in Black reports. One detail that makes his case particularly intriguing. Most Men in Black reports involve unnamed individuals. They're described only by appearance and behaviour. No names are given, no identities are claimed. They're anonymous figures who exist only in the role they're playing. But Indrid Cold introduced himself. He gave a name. Strange as that name might be, it was specific, deliberate. This raises troubling questions. Was Indrid Cold a real person using a false name? Was the name itself some kind of code or designation? Or was it an attempt by something non-human to create a plausible human identity without fully understanding how human names work? The fact that no records exist for anyone named Indrid Cold working in any government capacity during that time period suggests the name was fabricated. But why fabricate a name that sounds so obviously wrong? Why not choose something more conventional, more forgettable, unless the wrongness was intentional, unless the name was designed to be remembered? To stick in the mind of the witness and create that sense of unease that makes the encounter unforgettable. In the literature of Men in Black encounters, there's a theory that these visitors are not trying to silence witnesses. If they wanted silence, there are more effective methods. Instead, they seem designed to destabilize, to create confusion and doubt, to make the witness question their own perceptions. By appearing with apparent authority but no proof of authority, they create cognitive dissonance. The witness knows something is wrong but can't quite articulate what. They want to report the encounter, but to whom? The visitors claim to be from the government. How do you report a suspicious government agent to the government? It's a psychological trap, and it's remarkably effective. Chris Bledsoe experienced exactly this. After Indrid Cold's visit, he attempted to verify the encounter. He called local authorities, he contacted federal agencies, he tried to find any record of an investigation into his sighting, and he found nothing. No one had authorised an interview. No one had sent an investigator. No agency claimed responsibility. The visit had occurred in a bureaucratic void. Officially it never happened, but Bledsoe knew it had happened. He had sat across from Indrid Cold. He had answered the questions. The encounter was undeniably real. But how do you prove something that leaves no evidence? How do you convince others of an experience that exists only in memory? This is the genius, if we can call it that, of the Men in Black phenomenon. It operates in the space between proof and experience. It's real enough to traumatize the witness, but intangible enough to resist verification. And Indrid Cold executed this perfectly. Chapter 6. The name itself. Let's spend some time examining the name, because in cases like this, every detail matters. Names are how we identify ourselves, how we establish identity within social structures. They carry cultural weight, family history, personal meaning. Indrid Cold. Say it out loud. Let the syllables form in your mouth. Notice how they feel, how they sound, the way they combine. There's something fundamentally strange about this name. It doesn't flow naturally. It doesn't have the organic quality that most names possess. It sounds constructed, assembled, like something created by someone who understood that humans have names, but didn't fully grasp the cultural and linguistic patterns that govern how names actually work. Let's start with the first name, Indrid. Indrid is a Scandinavian name. It derives from Old Norse and means beautiful or fair. It's traditionally a feminine name, though not exclusively so. It was popular in Scandinavian countries and among Scandinavian immigrant communities in America during the early to mid-20th century. For a man to have the name Indrid is unusual, not impossible. Names sometimes cross gender boundaries. Parents make unconventional choices. Cultural contexts shift, but it's uncommon enough to be notable. The name also carries a specific cultural and temporal association. It feels like a name from a particular era, the 1930s through the 1950s, the age of Ingrid Bergman and similar cultural figures. It's not a contemporary name, not something you'd expect a government agent in 2007 to possess, unless, of course, that agent was operating from outdated information about human naming conventions, unless whoever or whatever created the identity Indrid Cold was working from source material that was decades old. Now consider the surname, Cold. Cold is an English surname with Germanic roots. It's uncommon but not unknown. Like many surnames, it likely originated as a descriptive term. Perhaps an ancestor lived in a cold region. Perhaps they had a cold demeanour. Perhaps it was a mistranslation or corruption of another name. But paired with Indrid, it takes on new meaning. The name becomes allegorical. Indrid Cold. Cold as in emotionally distant, detached, unfeeling, inhuman. It's almost too perfect. Too on the nose. Like a name chosen to communicate something about the person bearing it. A designation rather than an identity. Some researchers have suggested the name is a code, that Indrid might refer to a specific program or operation, that cold might indicate a particular role or function within whatever system deployed this visitor. In intelligence communities, code names are common. Operations are given designations that mean nothing to outsiders, but communicate specific information to those in the know. Could Indrid Cold be such a designation? A way for one operative to identify themselves to another, not meant to be a convincing human name, but rather a signal that would be recognised by the right audience. Others believe the name is a translation error. This theory suggests that whatever entity Indrid Cold truly was, it was attempting to translate its actual designation into human language, and arrived at something that was close but not quite right. Like running a phrase through a faulty translation algorithm and getting output that's technically correct, but sounds wrong to a native speaker. In this interpretation, Indrid Cold might be the closest English approximation of something that exists in a non-human language or conceptual framework. The entity understood it needed a name. It attempted to generate one, but lacking true understanding of how human names function culturally and linguistically, it produced something that was almost right but fundamentally off. Still others think the name is intentionally unsettling, that it was chosen specifically to create discomfort and doubt in the witness, a psychological tactic designed to make the encounter more memorable and more disturbing. If you want someone to remember an interaction, you give them something that doesn't fit, something that creates cognitive dissonance, something their brain will keep returning to because it can't quite process it correctly. A man with a woman's name, a combination that sounds like allegory, a designation that feels like code. These elements stick in memory. They create that uncanny valley effect. They make the witness question not just the visitor, but their own perception of the encounter. What we know for certain is this. There are no records of anyone named Indrid Cold working for any known government agency during that time period. No employment records, no public listings, no digital footprint, no paper trail, nothing. In the modern era, this kind of complete absence is almost impossible to achieve. We all leave traces, social security numbers, tax records, employment history, credit reports, online presence. Even people who deliberately try to live off the grid leave some kind of documentation. But Indrid Cold left nothing. Bledsoe tried to find him, tried to verify his existence through every channel he could think of, and came up empty every single time. It was as though the name existed only in that single conversation, spoken once and then dissolved back into whatever void it had emerged from. The name exists only in Chris Bledsoe's account, only in the testimony of a witness describing an encounter that officially never happened with a person who officially never existed. And that absence is, in its own way, more disturbing than his presence ever was. Because if Indrid Cold was a real person using a false name, there should still be some trace of the real person, some way to track backwards from the encounter to an actual identity. But there's nothing. If the name was a code, someone in the intelligence community should recognise it. Someone should be able to confirm that yes, this is a designation we use, even if they can't reveal what it means. But no one does. If it was a translation error, there should be similar cases, other witnesses, encountering visitors with equally strange names that suggest attempted translation from non-human frameworks. And while there are strange names in Men in Black reports, none quite match this pattern. The mystery of the name remains unsolved. Like everything else about Indrid Cold, it exists in that space between rational explanation and genuine anomaly. Close enough to normal to almost make sense. Strange enough to resist any comfortable interpretation. Indrid Cold. A name that sounds like it should be real but isn't. A designation that might mean everything or nothing. An identity that exists only in the moment of its claiming and nowhere else. Say it again. Indrid Cold. Feel how the syllables don't quite fit together, how the name creates a small discomfort in the mind. That discomfort is intentional, or it's an accident that reveals deeper truth about the nature of the phenomenon. Either way, it's effective. Because decades from now, when other details of this case have faded, that name will remain. Indrid Cold. The man who might not have been a man at all. The agent without a file. The visitor who existed only long enough to ask his questions, and then disappeared. Chapter 7. The silence that followed. After Indrid Cold left Chris Bledsoe's home, walking out the door and vanishing into impossible absence, there was no follow-up. No phone calls, no letters, no second visit, no contact of any kind. This itself was strange, because in any legitimate investigation there's always follow-up. Law enforcement comes back with additional questions as new information emerges. Federal agents maintain contact with witnesses. Even insurance adjusters check in to clarify details. Follow-up is standard procedure. It's how investigations work. You conduct an initial interview, gather preliminary information, and then return with more specific questions once you've had time to analyse what you've learned. But Indrid Cold never returned, and no one else showed up in his place. Bledsoe waited for days, expecting another knock on the door. He kept his phone close, anticipating a call. He checked his mail for official correspondence. Nothing came. The silence was absolute, as though the interview had been a self-contained event with no connection to any larger process. A data collection mission that began and ended in that single 30-minute conversation. After a week of waiting, Bledsoe decided to take action. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong about the encounter. The lack of credentials, the strange behaviour, the impossible knowledge, the name that sounded fake, all of it added up to something that required investigation. So he started making calls. His first attempt was local law enforcement. He called the Fayetteville Police Department and asked if they had sent anyone to interview him about a UFO sighting. The officer who answered the phone was polite but confused. No, they hadn't sent anyone. They don't investigate UFO sightings. That's not within their jurisdiction. Bledsoe tried the county sheriff's office. Same response. No one had been dispatched. They had no record of his incident, and they certainly hadn't sent anyone named Indrid Cold. He contacted the North Carolina State Police. Again, nothing. No investigation, no record, no agent by that name in their system. Moving up the chain, Bledsoe tried federal agencies, the FBI first. He called their Charlotte field office and explained the situation. A man claiming to represent a government agency had shown up at his home asking questions. The man had provided no identification. Bledsoe wanted to verify if this was legitimate, or if he should be concerned about potential fraud or impersonation. The FBI took his report. They seemed interested, professional. They said someone would look into it and get back to him. No one ever did. He tried the Department of Defense. Surely if there was a program investigating UFO sightings, it would be connected to military intelligence in some way. But navigating the DoD's phone system was like trying to find your way through a maze designed to prevent navigation. He was transferred multiple times, placed on hold for extended periods, eventually disconnected. When he finally reached someone who listened to his story, they told him there was no current program investigating UFO phenomena. That program had ended in the 1960s. If he wanted to file a report, he could contact NASA or the FAA, but the military had no active interest in such cases. Bledsoe tried NASA. They were polite but clear. They study space, not unidentified aerial phenomena. They recommended he contact local law enforcement. Full circle. Back to square one. Every agency passing responsibility to another agency, all of them claiming no knowledge, no involvement, no interest. It was bureaucratic limbo. His encounter existed in a gap between jurisdictions, falling through the cracks of official systems that weren't designed to handle this kind of report. But here's what made it truly unsettling. Indrid Cold had demonstrated detailed knowledge of Bledsoe's encounter. He had asked specific questions about timing, duration, physical details. He had known things that Bledsoe hadn't shared with anyone outside his immediate family. If no government agency was investigating, how had Cold obtained that information? If there was no active program monitoring UFO phenomena, how had he known about the sighting in the first place? The only logical explanations were disturbing. Either there was a classified program operating outside normal channels, one that denied its own existence even to other government agencies, a black budget operation so compartmentalised that the left hand genuinely didn't know what the right hand was doing, or Indrid Cold had never been part of the government at all. He had simply claimed to be, and his knowledge came from some other source entirely, a source that had access to information no human agency could possess. Bledsoe didn't know which explanation was more frightening. He tried one more avenue: Freedom of Information Act requests. If there was any documentation of his case, any official record of an investigation, FOIA requests should surface it. Even if the content was redacted, the existence of files would confirm that something had happened. He filed requests with every agency he could think of: FBI, CIA, DIA, NSA, DOD. Each request asked for any and all documents related to his UFO sighting and any subsequent investigations. The responses trickled in over the following months. The FBI found no records. The CIA found no records. The DIA found no records. Every agency came back with the same answer: negative results. No documentation matched his search parameters. It was as though the entire event had occurred outside official reality. The sighting had happened, the visit had happened, but, according to every official system designed to track and document such events, nothing had happened at all. This is where the case moves from strange to officially unsettling. Because in any legitimate government operation, there is documentation. There are records. There is a chain of command. There are forms to fill out, reports to file, databases to update. Even the most highly classified operations leave paper trails. They exist in systems, even if those systems are compartmentalised and access restricted. When the government interviews someone, that interview generates documentation. An agent files a report. The information is logged. The case is assigned a number. It enters the bureaucratic machinery that processes information. But Indrid Cold left nothing. No report, no case file, no assignment number, no documentation whatsoever. It's almost impossible for a legitimate government agent to operate that way. The entire system is built on documentation. You can't function within the bureaucracy without generating records, unless you're not part of the bureaucracy, unless you're operating entirely outside it, unless you're something that's only pretending to be part of official systems while actually existing in a completely different framework. Bledsoe was not alone in this experience. When he eventually connected with UFO researchers and shared his story, he learned that other witnesses had reported similar patterns. Visits from alleged government agents that left no trace, interviews that were never documented, follow-up that never materialized. The pattern suggested something deliberate. These visitors, whoever or whatever they were, operated in a way that specifically avoided creating documentation. They appeared, they observed, they asked their questions, and then they vanished, leaving the witness to wonder if the encounter was real at all. This is what some researchers call high strangeness, events that are too structured to be, Hallucinations, but too anomalous to fit within conventional reality. Encounters that have the feel of intelligence and purpose, but resist every attempt at verification or documentation. Bledsoe's attempts to verify Indrid Cold's visit became part of the case itself. The complete absence of records became evidence. Not evidence that it didn't happen, but evidence that something deliberately designed to avoid documentation had happened. And that absence spoke volumes. It suggested intentionality. It suggested a system operating parallel to official systems. It suggested visitors who understood they needed to appear official, without actually being official, who knew exactly how to navigate the gaps in bureaucratic coverage. Or it suggested something that didn't understand bureaucracy at all, that simply mimicked what it thought official authority looked like, without grasping the underlying structures that make such authority real. Either way, the silence that followed Indrid Cold's visit was not empty. It was full of negative space, full of absences that outlined a presence, full of missing documentation that testified to something that occurred outside documented reality. The phone calls stopped. The FOIA requests dried up. Bledsoe eventually accepted that he would never get official confirmation of what had happened. But he knew. He had sat across from Indrid Cold. He had heard that mechanical voice. He had felt that uncanny presence. The encounter was real, even if every official system insisted it wasn't. Chapter 8. Expansion of the theory. As word of the Indrid Cold encounter spread through UFO research communities, it began to take on a life of its own. Researchers connected it to other cases. Witnesses came forward with similar experiences. Patterns emerged that suggested this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, more complex phenomenon. The story moved beyond simple Men in Black comparisons. It became a reference point for understanding something deeper about how high strangeness events unfold, about the relationship between the initial encounter and what comes after, about the ways in which contact with the unexplained doesn't end when the lights disappear. One of the most significant frameworks that emerged was the concept of the hitchhiker effect. The term was coined by researchers studying cases where paranormal or anomalous events seemed to follow witnesses long after their initial encounter, as though the experience had opened a door that couldn't be easily closed. The pattern was remarkably consistent across diverse cases. Someone witnesses a UFO. The immediate encounter ends. They return to normal life. And then strange things start happening. Electronic disturbances, devices malfunctioning without explanation, computers behaving erratically, phones receiving calls from numbers that don't exist, sleep disturbances, vivid dreams, night terrors, the sense of being watched while trying to sleep, waking up in positions or locations different from where they went to bed, synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that pile up beyond statistical probability, seeing repeating number patterns, encountering people who mention the exact thing you were just thinking about, experiences that feel orchestrated. And then there were the visitors, not just Men in Black, though they were certainly part of the pattern, but also other strange figures, people who appeared at odd times, asked bizarre questions, and then disappeared without explanation. In some cases, these visitors claimed to be checking meters or delivering packages, but when the witness looked outside moments later, no vehicle was visible. When they checked with utility companies or delivery services, no one had been dispatched to their address. The hitchhiker effect suggests that UFO encounters are not discrete events. They're not something that happens and then ends. They're more like infections, contaminations. Once you've had contact, you're marked, tagged, and the phenomenon continues to interact with you in ways that are subtle, confusing, and deeply disorienting. Chris Bledsoe's experience fit this pattern perfectly. The UFO encounter on the Cape Fear River was just the beginning. Indrid Cold's visit was the next phase, and then came everything else. The electronic disturbances. His computers failed at critical moments. His phone would ring and no one would be on the line, or a voice would speak in that same flat, mechanical tone he had heard from Indrid Cold. The sleep disturbances. He would wake at exactly 3 a.m, night after night, feeling completely alert as though something had woken him deliberately. His dreams became populated with strange figures who asked questions and spoke in formal, archaic language. The continued sightings. The lights appeared again, multiple times, sometimes alone, sometimes with family members present, always with that same sense of being acknowledged, recognised, tracked, and there were more visitors, not always claiming to be government agents, but always appearing unexpectedly and behaving strangely. A man who showed up claiming to be conducting a survey, but asked questions that seemed designed to assess Bledsoe's mental state. A woman who appeared at his workplace asking about the events, without specifying which events she meant. Each encounter added to the sense that he was being observed, monitored, that his life had become an ongoing experiment or observation project run by something that existed just outside his ability to perceive it directly. UFO researchers who studied Bledsoe's case began comparing it to other high-strangeness scenarios. The more they looked, the more patterns emerged. There was the case of John Keel, the researcher who coined the term Men in Black, and documented countless similar encounters during his investigations in the 1960s. Keel himself experienced the hitchhiker effect. The more he researched UFOs, the more strange events occurred in his own life. Phone calls with mysterious voices, letters that appeared in his mailbox without postage, visitors who knew things they shouldn't know. Keel eventually came to believe that the UFO phenomenon was not extraterrestrial in the traditional sense. It was something stranger, something that existed alongside human reality, occasionally intersecting with it, manipulating perception, and creating experiences that seemed designed to confuse and destabilize. There was the case of Whitley Strieber, who wrote about his experiences in communion. Strieber described not just alien encounters, but a complete transformation of his reality. Strange visitors, missing time, the sense that his entire life had become permeable to forces he couldn't understand or control. There was the Skinwalker Ranch phenomenon, where researchers documented layer upon layer of high strangeness events. UFO sightings were just the surface. Below that were animal mutilations, poltergeist activity, apparitions, time distortions, and yes, mysterious visitors who appeared on the property without explanation. The common thread through all these cases was that the phenomenon didn't behave like simple extraterrestrial visitation. It behaved like intelligence at play, like something running experiments or tests, like something that wanted to interact with human consciousness in ways that resisted simple categorization. And central to many of these cases were visitors like Indrid Cold, figures that appeared human but behaved strangely, that claimed authority without providing proof, that demonstrated impossible knowledge and then vanished without trace. Some researchers proposed that these visitors served a specific function. They weren't trying to silence witnesses. If that was the goal, there were more efficient methods. Instead, they seemed designed to destabilize, to create paranoia, to make the witness question their own perceptions. By appearing with authority but no credentials, they created cognitive dissonance. The witness knew something was wrong but couldn't articulate what. They wanted to report the encounter but didn't know to whom. The visitors claimed to represent official systems, so how do you report them to those same systems? It was a psychological trap, and it was remarkably effective. Witnesses became isolated. They stopped talking about their experiences. They withdrew from research communities. They questioned their own memories and perceptions. If the goal was to prevent information from spreading, this method worked better than direct threats or intimidation, because it turned the witness's own mind against them. But here's where the theory gets darker, and more disturbing in its implications. Some researchers suggest that these follow-up encounters are not just monitoring or intimidation. They serve a deeper function. They're part of the experience itself. The UFO sighting is not the event, it's the trigger. The real interaction happens in the days and weeks and months that follow. In this interpretation, beings like Indrid Cold are not separate from the UFO phenomenon. They are the UFO phenomenon, manifesting in a different form. The lights in the sky get your attention. They create the initial trauma or transformation, and then the phenomenon continues to interact with you through forms that are more personally invasive. through visitors who appear in your home, through dreams that feel more real than dreams should feel, through synchronicities that erode your confidence in consensus reality. The goal in this framework is not observation, it's transformation. The phenomenon is trying to change how you perceive reality, to open doors in your consciousness that you didn't know existed, to make you permeable to experiences that most humans never have access to. Why would it do this? We can only speculate. Perhaps it's conducting an experiment. Perhaps it's trying to communicate in the only way it knows how. Perhaps it's preparing certain individuals for something. Perhaps there is no goal at all, just interaction for its own sake. What we do know is that witnesses like Chris Bledsoe never fully return to normal. The experience marks them permanently. They become different people, more open to strange possibilities, more willing to question consensus reality, more aware that the world contains depths most people never perceive. In this interpretation, Indrid Cold was not there to investigate or intimidate. He was there to continue the contact, to let Bledsoe know that what had begun by the Cape Fear River was not over, to ensure that he understood on some level that bypassed conscious thought that he had been chosen, marked, brought into a reality that most people never access, and if that's true, it worked. Because Bledsoe's life was never the same. The encounters continued, the strange events multiplied, and he became someone who lives between worlds, navigating both consensus reality and something stranger that exists alongside it. Whether Indrid Cold was human, non-human, or something in between, his visit served its purpose. It ensured that Chris Bledsoe would never be able to forget what had happened on that cold January night. And it ensured that he would always be watching the sky, waiting for the lights to return, because they always do. Chapter 9. Psychological or non-human? This brings us to the core question, the one that every serious researcher must grapple with when examining cases like this, the question that has no easy answer but demands to be asked. What was Indrid Cold? There are two dominant interpretations, two frameworks for understanding an encounter that resists simple explanation, and the truth, if we can ever access it, probably lies somewhere in the complex space between them. The first interpretation is psychological. The human mind is extraordinarily complex. It processes vast amounts of sensory data every second, filtering most of it out to create a coherent narrative of experience. Under normal circumstances, this works well. We perceive reality in ways that allow us to function, navigate, survive. But under conditions of extreme stress or trauma, these processes can break down. The mind can create false memories. It can distort real experiences. It can generate perceptions that feel absolutely real but have no external referent. This is not a weakness. It's a feature. The mind is designed to find patterns, create coherence, generate meaning. When faced with something that doesn't fit existing frameworks, it adapts. It creates an explanation that makes sense within the person's understanding of how reality works. Chris Bledsoe experienced something profoundly traumatic by the Cape Fear River. Whether it was truly anomalous or had some conventional explanation, the psychological impact was real. The fear, the disorientation, the sense of encountering something beyond comprehension. In the days following such an experience, the mind is vulnerable, still processing, still trying to make sense of what happened. Defense mechanisms are active. The person is in a heightened state of alertness, scanning for threats, interpreting neutral stimuli as potentially dangerous. In this state, it's possible that Bledsoe did receive a visitor, perhaps a journalist who had somehow learned about the sighting, perhaps a local investigator, perhaps even a legitimate government employee who happened to be in the area and was curious about the report. And in Bledsoe's traumatized, hyper-alert state, his mind transformed that visitor into something strange. Memory distortion amplified by stress created the odd behaviours, the mechanical speech, the lack of credentials. His mind filled in gaps with elements drawn from cultural narratives about men in black, creating a coherent story that fit the trauma he had just experienced. The odd name could be a memory error. Perhaps the visitor gave a normal name that Bledsoe misheard or misremembered. The lack of credentials could be a detail his stressed mind simply overlooked. The strange behaviours could be normal behaviours interpreted through the lens of trauma as threatening and wrong. This is the rational explanation, the one that fits within consensus reality and psychological science, and it cannot be entirely dismissed. We know that memory is malleable, we know that trauma affects perception, we know that people under stress misinterpret neutral stimuli. There are decades of research supporting these facts, but here's the problem. This explanation doesn't account for everything. It doesn't explain how Indrid Cole demonstrated knowledge of details Bledsoe had never shared publicly, details about the sighting that only Bledsoe and his immediate family knew. Unless there was surveillance, which Bledsoe's subsequent investigations found no evidence of, there's no conventional way for a stranger to possess that information. It doesn't explain why no person or agency ever claimed responsibility for the visit, why no one came forward when Bledsoe made inquiries, why his FOIA requests turned up nothing. If a real person conducted that interview, they should exist somewhere in some system, but they don't. It doesn't explain the predictions that came true, the specific statements Indrid Cole made about future events in Bledsoe's life that materialised exactly as described. Unless we're willing to attribute all of that to coincidence, which strengthens credibility, it doesn't explain the patterns. The fact that dozens of other UFO witnesses have reported nearly identical encounters with visitors who display the same behaviours, ask the same types of questions, and vanish in the same inexplicable way. If each case was individual psychological distortion, the distortion shouldn't be so consistent across different people in different locations at different times. The psychological explanation accounts for some elements, but not all, and the elements it can't account for are precisely the ones that make this case significant. Which brings us to the second interpretation, non-human intelligence. If the UFO encounter itself was real, if what Chris Bledsoe witnessed that night was genuinely anomalous and not susceptible to conventional explanation, then we must consider the possibility that Indrid Cole was part of that same phenomenon. Not a government investigator, not a misremembered journalist, but something else entirely. Something that understood it needed to present as human authority, but lacked the full capacity to execute that presentation convincingly. This would explain everything the psychological model struggles with. The impossible knowledge becomes explicable if Indrid Cole was connected to whatever intelligence orchestrated the UFO encounter. If he was part of the same system, he would naturally know details about the event without need for surveillance or investigation. The lack of records becomes logical if Indrid Cole never existed within human systems. If he was a construct, a temporary manifestation created for this specific interaction, then of course there would be no employment history, no documentation, no trace in official databases. The strange behaviours make sense if this was an attempt by non-human intelligence to mimic human authority figures. The formal speech patterns could reflect an understanding of how officials should speak based on outdated or incomplete information. The rigid posture could be a misunderstanding of human body language. The lack of blinking could be a simple oversight in the mimicry. The name itself could be a translation error or a designation that was never meant to be a convincing human name. Just a label that would suffice for this brief interaction. In this interpretation, Indrid Cole was never human. He was something wearing a human appearance the way we might wear a costume. Close enough to pass casual inspection, but revealing its artificiality upon closer examination. But this interpretation raises its own difficult questions. If Indrid Cole was a non-human entity, what was he? An alien in a physical sense? Some kind of interdimensional being? A construct created through technology we don't understand? A manifestation of consciousness that doesn't require physical substrate? Why appear at all? If the goal was simply to monitor witnesses, there are less detectable methods. Why risk exposure through direct contact? Why the bureaucratic approach? Why mimic government authority specifically? What purpose does that serve? And most fundamentally, if non-human intelligence has the capacity to create convincing human forms, why create one that's not quite convincing? Why include elements that trigger the uncanny valley response? Why not make the disguise perfect, unless imperfection is intentional, unless the strangeness serves a purpose, unless the goal is not to be convincing but to be memorable, to create an experience that will stick in the witness's mind, to generate exactly the kind of confusion and questioning that makes the encounter significant. In psychological operations, there's a technique called defamiliarization. You take something familiar and make it slightly wrong. This triggers deeper processing. The mind can't simply categorize it as normal and move on. It has to engage. It has to question. It has to remember. If non-human intelligence understands human psychology, and there's considerable evidence it does, then sending a visitor who is almost human but not quite might be a deliberate strategy. It ensures the witness will remember, will question, will be transformed by the experience. But here's the deepest question, the one that both interpretations struggle with. Why does it matter which explanation is correct? Whether Indrid Cold was a psychological manifestation or a non-human entity, the effect on Chris Bledsoe was the same. His reality was fundamentally altered. He experienced something that resisted conventional explanation. He was marked by an encounter that transformed his relationship with consensus reality. From Bledsoe's subjective perspective, the distinction between real and psychological becomes meaningless. The experience was real to him. It had real consequences. It changed his life in measurable ways. This is what researchers mean when they talk about experiential reality. What matters is not necessarily what objectively occurred, but what the witness experienced and how that experience affected them. Indrid Cold existed. Maybe not in the way a normal human exists, maybe not in physical space the way we understand it, but he existed in Chris Bledsoe's experience, and that existence had consequences. The two interpretations, psychological and non-human, are not necessarily exclusive. Reality may be stranger and more complex than either framework alone can capture. Perhaps consciousness and external reality interact in ways that make the boundary between them more permeable than we usually assume. Perhaps high strangeness encounters occur in a space where psychology and objective reality blur together, where the mind's capacity to create experience intersects with genuine anomalous phenomena, where the question, did this really happen, becomes impossible to answer because it happened in a mode that doesn't fit our categories of real versus imaginary. The case of Indrid Cold remains unresolved. We have one witness's testimony. We have patterns that connect this case to many others. We have an absence of documentation that is itself significant. But we have no definitive proof, no smoking gun that would confirm either interpretation beyond doubt, and perhaps that's exactly how it's meant to be. Because the uncertainty, the ambiguity, the impossibility of resolution, these are all part of the experience, part of what makes high strangeness cases transformative. They force us to sit with not knowing, to accept that reality might be more complex than our frameworks can capture, to recognise that our confident categories of real versus unreal, human versus non-human, psychological versus objective, might be insufficient for understanding what's actually happening. Indrid Cold walked out of Chris Bledsoe's house and vanished. Where he went, we cannot say. Whether he ever truly existed in the first place, we cannot prove. But he left behind questions that refuse to be easily answered, and sometimes the questions themselves are the point. Chapter 10. Why the Story Persists. We're now several years past the original encounter. Chris Bledsoe's experience with Indrid Cold has entered the permanent record of high strangeness cases. It's discussed in research forums, analysed in books, referenced by investigators working on similar cases. The question is, why? Why does this story persist when so many others fade into obscurity? The case of Indrid Cold endures because it resists easy categorization. It occupies a unique space in UFO research. Not flashy enough for mainstream media attention, not obscure enough to be forgotten, sitting precisely in that zone where serious researchers find the most interesting data. Consider what this case is not. It is not sensational. There are no dramatic abductions, no surgical procedures performed by aliens, no apocalyptic warnings delivered by otherworldly beings. The encounter with Indrid Cold was quiet, mundane almost, in its execution. A man knocked on a door, asked questions, left. That's the entire visible sequence of events. From an outside observer's perspective, nothing extraordinary occurred. This mundanity is precisely what makes it compelling, because the devil is in the details. The strangeness emerges not from what happened, but from how it happened. The small discrepancies, the subtle wrongness, the accumulation of minor anomalies that add up to something significant. There are no threats. Indrid Cold never intimidated Bledsoe, never warned him to stay silent, never made veiled or explicit threats about consequences if he spoke publicly about his experience. The classic Men in Black narrative involves intimidation, but this case lacks that element. Instead, the intimidation, if we can call it that, was more subtle. It came from the encounter itself, from the wrongness of Indrid Cold's presence, from the realization that someone who shouldn't exist had shown up and demonstrated knowledge they shouldn't possess. The psychological impact was profound, but it didn't come from threats. It came from destabilization, from having your reality undermined in small but significant ways. There are no dramatic confrontations, no chase scenes, no physical evidence left behind, no photographs or recordings, just one man's testimony about a 30-minute conversation that officially never happened. It's a quiet encounter, almost mundane in its execution. And yet, it lingers. It refuses to be dismissed or forgotten. It occupies mental space in researchers and witnesses who encounter the story. Why? Because it taps into something primal, something that operates below conscious reasoning. The fear of being watched, not by cameras or governments in the conventional sense, but by something that exists outside the normal frameworks of observation, something that sees you without your knowledge or consent, something that knows things about you it has no business knowing. The fear of authority without accountability. We live in systems built on accountability. Police officers have badge numbers, federal agents have supervisors, even the most powerful individuals operate within structures that theoretically provide oversight. But what if you encounter authority that has no oversight, that answers to no one, that can operate completely outside normal systems of accountability? That's a fundamentally different kind of power, and it's terrifying precisely because it's unconstrained. The fear that the people who claim to protect us might not be people at all. We build our societies on certain assumptions. One of those assumptions is that we can recognize other humans, that we know what human behavior looks like, that anyone who walks and talks like a person is a person. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if human appearance can be mimicked by something non-human? What if the familiar forms we encounter daily might occasionally be masks worn by something else entirely? That possibility undermines fundamental trust. It makes every interaction potentially suspect. It introduces paranoia into the most basic social exchanges. These fears are not rational in the conventional sense. They're evolutionary. They're wired deep in our psychology. And the Indrid Cold case activates all of them without providing any resolution or comfort. The case also persists because it's modern. This is not a story from the 1950s, buried in dusty files and fading memories. This happened in 2007, in the age of digital records and pervasive surveillance, in a time when anonymity should be nearly impossible to achieve. If this case had occurred in 1953, we could dismiss the lack of documentation as a product of that era. Records were less comprehensive, information systems were more fragmented. It was easier for things to slip through the cracks. But in 2007, in an era where almost everyone leaves digital footprints, where employment records are computerized, where background checks can surface information from decades past, where the internet makes anonymity increasingly difficult, the complete absence of any trace of Indrid Cold in this context is far more significant. It suggests either a level of operational security that exceeds anything in the public knowledge base, or it suggests someone who never existed within human systems in the first place. And yet Indrid Cold remains anonymous, despite the digital tools available, despite the searchable databases, despite the interconnected information systems that theoretically make everyone traceable. He exists only in Chris Bledsoe's testimony, only in the pattern of similar encounters reported by other witnesses, only in the negative space created by his absence from official records. There's also the matter of credibility. Chris Bledsoe never sought fame from this experience. He didn't immediately write a book. He didn't go on a media tour. He didn't start a podcast or a YouTube channel. He didn't attempt to monetize his encounter in any obvious way. He simply told his story, quietly and consistently, to researchers who were willing to listen without judgment, to investigators who approached the case with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined conclusions. That authenticity matters, because when someone fabricates a story, they tend to embellish. They add dramatic elements. They make themselves the hero. They create a narrative arc that builds to a satisfying conclusion. Bledsoe did none of that. His account is restrained, almost reluctant. He describes what happened without trying to convince anyone it happened. He presents the facts as he experienced them and leaves the interpretation to others. He admits to uncertainty where uncertainty exists. He acknowledges elements that might have conventional explanations. He doesn't claim to know things he doesn't know. This restraint is a hallmark of genuine experience. People who have truly encountered something anomalous often struggle to describe it. They use tentative language. They acknowledge gaps in their understanding. They resist the neat narratives that fictional accounts tend to produce. Bledsoe's testimony has that quality. It feels real precisely because it doesn't feel polished. It contains inconsistencies, not because he's lying, but because memory is imperfect and traumatic experiences are hard to articulate clearly. And that restraint is what makes it credible to serious researchers. They've encountered enough hoaxes and attention seekers to recognise the difference. The lack of embellishment is evidence of authenticity. The case also persists because it connects to something larger. It's not an isolated data point. It's part of a pattern that extends across decades and geographical boundaries. Other witnesses have reported similar encounters. The behaviours described, the impossible knowledge, the lack of credentials, the mechanical speech, the sudden appearances and disappearances, these patterns suggest a phenomenon, something systematic rather than random, something that repeats with enough consistency to indicate intelligence and purpose, and phenomena demand explanation. They resist being dismissed as one-off anomalies. They force serious engagement because they keep happening. The Indrid cold case has become a reference point. When new witnesses come forward with similar experiences, researchers compare notes. They look for common elements. They build databases of characteristics. And Indrid cold keeps appearing in those databases, not literally but as a pattern, as a type, as an example of how these encounters tend to unfold. That's why the story persists, not because it's sensational or dramatic, but because it's representative. It captures something essential about a type of experience that continues to occur. And as long as people keep reporting visits from strange men who claim authority without proving it, who know things they shouldn't know, and who vanish without trace, the case of Indrid Cold will remain relevant. It's a template, a framework for understanding encounters that resist conventional explanation. A reminder that sometimes the most disturbing events are not the ones that make headlines, but the quiet ones that happen behind closed doors and leave no evidence except in the transformed consciousness of the witness. Epilogue. The agent without a file. So who was Indrid Cold? After all this examination, all this analysis, all this careful consideration of evidence and interpretation, we return to the question that started this journey, and we find that we still don't have a definitive answer. We may never know. If he was human, there should be records. Every human who works for a government agency, every person who conducts official business leaves traces. Employment history, tax records, a social security number, a driver's license, background checks, security clearances, something. In the modern bureaucratic state, it's almost impossible to function officially without generating documentation. The entire system is built on paper trails and digital footprints. You cannot move through official channels without leaving evidence of your movement. But there's nothing. No employment records, no tax documentation, no security clearances, no badge numbers, no supervisors who remember assigning someone to investigate a UFO sighting in rural North Carolina. No databases that contain any reference to the name Indrid Cold in connection with official government work. The search has been exhaustive. Researchers have pursued every lead. FOIA requests have covered every conceivable agency. Private investigators have run background checks. The usual tools for verifying someone's existence and identity have all been deployed, and every single one has come back negative. If he was not human, if he was something else entirely, then the absence of records makes perfect sense. Because how do you document something that was never real in the conventional sense? How do you create an employment file for a temporary manifestation? How do you issue a social security number to a construct that exists only long enough to conduct one interview? How do you generate background checks for an entity that has no background? The absence of records could be evidence not of secretive efficiency, but of fundamental non-existence within human systems. The most convincing disguises, after all, are the ones that don't need to be explained. They simply exist briefly in the space between perception and reality. A perfect disguise would leave no trail because there would be nothing to trace. It would be smoke, appearing solid enough to be seen, but dissolving the moment you try to grasp it. Indrid Cold appeared. He manifested at Chris Bledsoe's door with enough substance to be perceived, engaged with, remembered. He asked his questions with enough presence to create the impression of authority and purpose. He demonstrated knowledge he should not have had, suggesting either impossible surveillance or impossible connection to the phenomenon itself. And then he left, dissolving back into whatever void he had emerged from, not leaving, through normal means, not getting into a car and driving away, just ceasing to be present, transitioning from existence to non-existence in the space between the door and the driveway. Chris Bledsoe is still alive, still living in North Carolina, still experiencing intermittent contact with whatever phenomenon marked him that January night in 2007. He has had additional sightings, additional encounters. The strangeness has not stopped. If anything, it has deepened, become more integrated into his life. He has learned to live with it, to navigate both ordinary reality and the stranger reality that exists alongside it. He still tells his story when asked, but he no longer expects answers. He has accepted that some questions cannot be answered within our current frameworks of understanding, that some experiences exist beyond the reach of conventional explanation. He knows what he experienced. He was there. He sat across from Indrid Cold. He heard that mechanical voice. He felt that uncanny presence. The encounter was real in every way that matters, whether others believe it, whether it can be proven, whether it fits within consensus reality. These have become secondary concerns. The encounter happened. It changed him. It opened doors in his consciousness that most people never access. It made him aware that the world contains depths and complexities that resist our neat categories and comfortable explanations, and he is not alone. Other witnesses continue to come forward. Other people report visits from strange figures who claim authority without proving it, who know things they shouldn't know, who appear and disappear in ways that defy conventional explanation. The pattern continues. The phenomenon persists. Whatever intelligence operates behind these encounters shows no sign of stopping. Because some encounters are not meant to be understood in conventional terms. They are meant to transform, to destabilize, to remind us that the world is stranger than we allow ourselves to believe, that there are doors we don't see until they open, visitors we cannot track until they appear, questions we're not equipped to answer with our current models of reality. Indrid Cold walked through one of those doors, or perhaps he was the door itself, a threshold between ordinary reality and something else, something that most people never access but that some, through accident or design, encounter directly. And somewhere, in some record system we cannot access, his visit may still be logged, not in FBI databases or CIA files or Department of Defense archives, but in whatever system actually tracks these encounters, whatever intelligence actually monitors contact between human witnesses and phenomena that refuse to be categorized. That record exists somewhere, in some framework we haven't discovered, in some archive beyond our current ability to access, not under his name, because Indrid Cold was never his name. It was never meant to be a real name. It was simply what he called himself, a designation that served its purpose for exactly 30 minutes, long enough to ask the questions, to demonstrate the impossible knowledge, to create the destabilization, and then to dissolve back into whatever matrix of reality generates such manifestations, leaving behind only a witness who will never forget, a story that will never be fully explained, and questions that will persist as long as people continue to look at the sky and wonder what else might be looking back. Closing thoughts. The Indrid cold case sits at the intersection of UFO research, men in black law, and modern high strangeness phenomena. It is a case without resolution, without proof, without closure. And perhaps that's the point, because the most effective way to control information is not to suppress it entirely. That creates martyrs, that generates suspicion, that makes the information more compelling through its very prohibition. No, the most effective way to control information is to make it unverifiable, to ensure that even when someone tells the truth, no one can prove it. To create a zone of ambiguity where the signal is real but permanently mixed with noise. To make truth and fiction indistinguishable. To ensure that anyone sharing the information can be dismissed as mistaken, delusional, or attention-seeking. This is more effective than censorship, because it allows the information to exist while stripping it of credibility. It creates a kind of containment through confusion. The truth is spoken, but it cannot spread effectively because it cannot be verified. If that's the strategy behind visits like Indrid Cold's, it's remarkably successful. Because Bledsoe's story exists, it's available, anyone can hear it, but it exists in that zone where proof is impossible and doubt is always available. Indrid Cold may have been a psychological manifestation, a distorted memory, a misidentified visitor whose normal characteristics were transformed by trauma into something strange. Or he may have been exactly what he appeared to be, an agent without a file, a representative of something we do not understand, a reminder that we are being watched by forces we cannot see, much less verify or control. The case remains open. Not officially, because there was never an official investigation. There were never official records. There is no official file to close. But in the minds of those who study the unexplained, in the collections of researchers who document high strangeness encounters, in the consciousness of witnesses like Chris Bledsoe, who have crossed thresholds most people never approach, Indrid Cold is still out there, still asking questions, still collecting data, still appearing at the homes of witnesses who have seen something they were perhaps not meant to see, and still leaving no trace, still generating no documentation, still existing in that impossible space between consensus, reality, and something stranger. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with this story through all its complexities and ambiguities. Thank you for being willing to sit with questions that have no easy answers. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the strangest cases in modern UFO research, please consider supporting the channel. Use your hype points if you're watching on YouTube. It genuinely helps more than you know and allows us to keep creating these detailed investigations into the unexplained. Leave a review if you're on Spotify. Reviews help other listeners find us and let us know what kinds of stories resonate with you. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We love hearing from you. We love knowing that these stories are reaching people in different time zones, different countries, different contexts. There's something beautiful about a global community united by curiosity about the strange and unexplained. Until next time, sleep well. Or try to, at least. And remember, not everyone who knocks on your door is who they claim to be. Not everyone who claims authority can prove it. Not everyone who knows things they shouldn't know has a conventional explanation for that knowledge. The world is stranger than we usually admit, full of doors we don't see, visitors we cannot track, encounters that transform us in ways we never fully understand. Chris Bledsoe opened one of those doors, or perhaps it was open for him. Perhaps it was never a door at all, but a threshold that dissolved the moment he crossed it, leaving him changed and unable to return to the innocent assumptions he once held about how reality works. That's what high strangeness does. It marks you, changes you, makes it impossible to see the world the same way again. And somewhere out there, Indrid Cold continues his work, asking his questions, appearing at the homes of witnesses, demonstrating impossible knowledge, and then vanishing, leaving behind only confusion, questions, and the slow transformation of consciousness that comes from encountering something that should not exist. This is Sleep Theories. Good night, and sweet dreams. Though after this story, I'm not sure how sweet those dreams will be. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story and finding it as fascinating as we do, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're watching the sunrise in Tokyo or settling in for the night in London. It's not required, but we genuinely enjoy connecting with our global community. Now, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a massive thank you to KD Lofty for suggesting this topic. This is one we've been wanting to cover for a long time, and your suggestion was the perfect push we needed. Imagine holding a secret so profound that releasing it could rewrite human history. Imagine being told to stay silent, not by choice, but by order. Now imagine that secret involves the most watched moment in television history, the Apollo 11 moon landing, and what 3 astronauts allegedly saw on the lunar surface that was never meant to reach the public. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most explosive conspiracy theories ever to emerge from the space race, a missing transmission, a hidden film reel, and the terrifying possibility that humanity's first steps on the moon were also our first encounter with something we were never supposed to find. Apollo 11. The transmission they never released. Part 1. The engineer's confession. The fluorescent lights in the Euston diner flickered as journalist Marcus Webb sat across from a man who looked like he'd been carrying the weight of the world for 50 years. Ernest Hale was 83 years old, his hands trembling slightly as they wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The wrinkles on his face seemed to deepen in the harsh light, and his eyes, once sharp and calculating during his years as a NASA communications engineer, now held something different. Fear, regret, and an urgent need to unburden himself before time ran out. 2 minutes and 42 seconds, Hale said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's how much they cut. Marcus had received the cryptic email 3 weeks earlier. No details, just a time and a place, and a single line that had made his investigative instincts flare to life, like a signal fire in the darkness. I know what Armstrong really saw on the moon. As a journalist specialising in declassified government documents and Cold War-era conspiracies, Marcus had heard plenty of wild claims about Apollo 11. Most were easily debunked fantasies, the kind of stories that fell apart the moment you applied even basic scrutiny. But something about Hale's message felt different. The man had credentials, a verifiable 40-year career at NASA, working specifically in communications during the Apollo program. This wasn't some basement-dwelling theorist. This was someone who had been in the room. "You're telling me NASA deliberately cut audio from the moon landing broadcast?" Marcus asked, activating the voice recorder on his phone and sliding it across the table. Hale nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red. Not just audio. There was a complete transmission blackout for exactly 2 minutes and 42 seconds, right after Armstrong set foot on the surface. The public version shows a brief interruption, static, technical difficulties. That's the official story. But I was in the communications room that night. I heard everything. And what did you hear? The old man's hands tightened around his cup. Armstrong's voice, different than before, shaken. He said, and I quote, "They're here. They're watching us." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm Texas evening. They? That's what he said. Houston immediately switched him to the medical channel, the encrypted line. Protocol was that channel was only for health emergencies, astronaut vital signs, things like that. But they used it for something else that day. They used it to have a conversation the world was never meant to hear. Marcus leaned forward, his journalistic skepticism warring with the undeniable conviction in Hale's voice. Why are you telling me this now? Why wait 50 years? Hale's laugh was bitter and hollow. Because I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 4 months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. I've kept this secret for half a century because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my pension. Afraid of being labelled a lunatic. Afraid of what they might do to keep me quiet. But I'm out of time, and I can't take this to my grave. Someone needs to know the truth. The engineer reached into a worn leather satchel beside him and pulled out a manila folder, its edges frayed from age. Inside were photocopied pages, technical diagrams, and what appeared to be mission transcripts with entire sections blacked out. This is everything I managed to save before they sanitized the records, Hale said, sliding the folder across the table. Start with July 20th, 1969. Start with the real history, then I'll show you where the lies begin. Part 2. The Descent. Marcus spent the next 3 days immersed in the documented facts of Apollo 11, separating verifiable history from speculation. The mission had launched on July 16th, 1969, from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 3 men, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, embarked on humanity's most ambitious journey. Their destination was the Sea of Tranquility, a vast lunar plain chosen for its relatively flat terrain. The early stages of the mission proceeded flawlessly. The Saturn V rocket performed exactly as designed, pushing the command module and lunar module out of Earth's orbit and onto a trajectory toward the Moon. For 3 days, the crew travelled through the void of space, performing course corrections and systems checks, their every movement monitored by ground control in Houston. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module, nicknamed Eagle, and began their descent to the surface while Collins remained in the command module, Columbia, orbiting above. This was where the first anomaly occurred, one that was documented in the official records but never fully explained. As Eagle descended toward the lunar surface, computer alarms began screaming in the cramped cockpit. Error code 1201, then 1202. Program alarms that indicated the guidance computer was being overwhelmed with data, receiving more information than it could process. In the official NASA narrative, these alarms were caused by a radar system inadvertently left on, flooding the computer with unnecessary data. Flight controllers in Houston made a split-second decision to proceed with the landing despite the alarms, trusting that the computer could handle the essential functions even while overloaded. But in Hale's documents, in the margins of a photocopied mission transcript, someone had written in pencil, "Alarms triggered by external scan. Eagle detected and scanned by." The question mark hung there, ominous and unfinished. Armstrong took manual control of Eagle, guiding it away from a boulder-strewn crater toward a smoother landing site. At this point, fuel was running critically low. The mission clock showed they had less than 30 seconds of landing fuel remaining when Armstrong's voice crackled through the speakers in Houston. "Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." The date was July 20th, 1969. The time was 8:17 post-meridium universal time. Humanity had reached the Moon, but according to Hale, something was already waiting there. Part 3. The First Steps and the Missing Minutes. 6.5 hours after landing, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch of the lunar module and began his careful descent down the ladder. The world watched grainy black and white images transmitted from a camera mounted on Eagle's exterior. An estimated 600 million people across the globe had their eyes fixed on television screens, witnessing something that had existed only in science fiction just a decade before. At 10:56 post-meridium Eastern Time, Armstrong's boot touched the lunar surface. His words became instant history. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The broadcast continued for several minutes, showing Armstrong's initial movements on the surface, his commentary about the fine, powdery consistency of the lunar soil, and his growing confidence in the low-gravity environment. Then, at approximately 11:02 post-meridian Eastern Time, the broadcast experienced what NASA described as a technical interruption. Static-filled television screens around the world. Walter Cronkite, anchoring CBS's coverage, assured viewers that engineers were working to restore the signal. The interruption lasted 2 minutes and 42 seconds, just as Hale had said. When the feed returned, Armstrong was further from the lunar module, collecting samples, and everything appeared normal. The mission proceeded. Aldrin joined him on the surface. They planted the American flag, collected rocks, set up scientific instruments, and spoke with President Nixon via a radio hookup. Then they returned to Eagle, launched back to orbit, docked with Columbia, and began the journey home. The official explanation for the broadcast interruption was a temporary failure in the signal relay from the Australian tracking station at Honeysuckle Creek. Equipment malfunction. Nothing unusual. The missing minutes were simply dead air, static, an unfortunate technical glitch in an otherwise flawless broadcast. But Hale's documents told a different story. In the folder he'd given Marcus was a page that appeared to be from an internal NASA communications log. Most of it was standard technical jargon, signal strength readings, tracking data, confirmation of uplink and downlink status. But there was one entry, time-stamped at 11:01 post-meridian Eastern Time, that made Marcus's heart race. Switch to med channel on CDR request. Override standard protocol. Restricted transcript to follow. Public feed hold for 2.7 minutes. CDR commander. Neil Armstrong had requested the channel switch himself. And there was something else in the folder. A fragmentary transcript labelled Apollo 11 EVA Medical Channel Excerpt, July 20, 1969, 11:01 to 11:03 p.m. Eastern. Most of it was redacted, thick black lines covering entire paragraphs, but a few lines remained visible. Armstrong. Houston, we have... There are other craft here. Repeat, other craft. Houston. Say again, Eagle. Armstrong. They're on the ridge. 3 of them. Lined up. They're watching us. Houston. Stand by, Eagle. Switching to... The rest was blacked out. Marcus read the fragment a dozen times, his mind racing. If this was authentic, if Armstrong had really reported seeing craft on the moon, then the implications were staggering. But he needed more than a photocopied document from a dying man. He needed corroboration. That's when Hale mentioned the second camera feed. Part 4. The hidden feed. According to Hale, there were 2 video channels transmitting from the Apollo 11 mission. The public feed, broadcast worldwide, originated from the camera mounted on Eagle's descent stage. But there was a second feed, encrypted and transmitted on a classified frequency, that went directly to a secure facility in Houston, with simultaneous feeds to Langley Air Force Base and the Pentagon. The second camera was inside Armstrong's helmet, Hale explained during their second meeting, this time at his modest ranch house on the outskirts of Houston. Part of the biomedical monitoring system officially. It was supposed to record the astronauts' field of view for training and debriefing purposes. But the real reason was reconnaissance. The Air Force wanted independent visual confirmation of everything the astronauts encountered. And you saw this second feed? Marcus asked. Hale nodded. I was part of the team monitoring communications integrity. I had access to all the channels, including the restricted ones. When Armstrong made his first report about the craft, they switched the helmet camera feed to the main screen in the control room. That's when I saw them. Them. Structures. On a ridge about half a mile from the landing site, cylindrical, metallic. They weren't natural formations. The shadows they cast were geometric, precise, and while we watched, one of them moved. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Moved how? It rotated, slowly, like it was tracking Armstrong's position. Then the feed cut out. Someone at a higher pay grade than me pulled the plug. When it came back online 30 seconds later, the camera was pointed at the ground. We never saw those structures again. And no one said anything? No one questioned it? Hale's expression hardened. 3 people in that room saw what I saw. 2 of them are dead now. The 3rd won't return my calls. We were told immediately after the mission that what we'd witnessed was classified under national security protocols. We signed additional non-disclosure agreements. We were reminded that violating those agreements would be considered treason. Marcus tried to process this. But why? If there were structures on the moon, artificial structures, why hide it? That would be the most significant discovery in human history. Think about it, Hale said quietly. July 1969. We're still in the Cold War. We've just beaten the Soviets to the moon by a matter of months. Now imagine announcing to the world that we found evidence of non-human intelligence up there. What happens? Panic? Maybe. But more importantly, what happens to the space race? Do the Americans and Soviets suddenly start cooperating? Do other nations demand access to lunar exploration? Do we lose our strategic advantage? So you're saying they covered it up for geopolitical reasons. I'm saying they covered it up because they didn't know what they were dealing with. Were these structures abandoned? Active? Were they watching us? Could they be hostile? The people making decisions decided it was safer to study this quietly, secretly, rather than denounce it to a world that wasn't ready. Marcus leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. I need to verify this. I need to talk to other people who were there. Hale smiled sadly. Good luck. Most of them are dead or won't talk. But there's one person you might try. Rosa Klein. She worked in the NASA archives for 30 years. She might remember some things. Part 5. The Archivist's Evidence. Rosa Klein lived in a small apartment in Pasadena, California, surrounded by stacks of books, photographs, and memories of a lifetime spent preserving humanity's reach into space. She was 76 years old, sharp as a tack, and deeply suspicious when Marcus first contacted her. Ernest Hale sent you? She asked over the phone, her voice guarded. I haven't spoken to Ernest in 20 years. Why would he send someone to me now? Because he's dying, Marcus said simply, and he wants the truth to come out before he goes. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Klein sighed. Come to Pasadena. We'll talk. But I'm not promising anything. 3 days later, Marcus sat in Klein's cramped living room, drinking tea from delicate china cups that seemed wildly out of place given the conversation they were about to have. I worked in the NASA archives from 1972 to 2002, Klein began, her eyes distant with memory. My job was to catalogue, preserve, and maintain access to mission documentation, photographs, film, audio recordings, everything. Apollo 11 was before my time, but the documentation from that mission was extensive. Thousands of photographs, hours of film, telemetry data, mission reports. And you found something unusual? Marcus prompted. Klein set down her teacup carefully. In 1987, I was conducting a routine inventory of Apollo 11 photographic materials. We had recently digitized a batch of images, and I was cross-referencing the digital copies against the physical archives. That's when I noticed discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? Missing images. The photo manifest, the official list of every photograph taken during the mission, listed several images that weren't in the archive. The designations were sequential, standard NASA format, as 11-something something. But when I tried to locate the physical photographs, they were gone. And here's the strange part. The gaps in the sequence all fell within a specific time frame. Let me guess, Marcus said. Right after the landing? Klein nodded. The missing images were all from the first 40 minutes Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface. I filed a report about the discrepancy. 2 weeks later, my supervisor called me into his office and told me I'd made a mistake. The missing photos had never existed. The manifest I'd seen was an early draft that included planned photos that were never actually taken due to time constraints. But you didn't believe that? Of course not. I'd been doing that job for 15 years. I knew the difference between a preliminary photo plan and a completed mission manifest, but I also knew when to keep my mouth shut. I let go, officially. And unofficially? Clayne stood and walked to a bookshelf crammed with binders and folders. She pulled out a slim blue folder and handed it to Marcus. Inside was a photocopy of a document, yellowed with age but still legible. It was a photo manifest stamped with official NASA headers and dated August 5th, 1969. Marcus scanned the list of image designations, his pulse quickening as he saw the gaps Clayne had mentioned. AS-11-43 through AS-11-51 were missing. 8 consecutive images. I made a copy before they sanitized the records, Clayne said quietly. I knew someday someone would ask questions. I just didn't think it would take this long. What do you think those photos showed? Clayne sat back down, her hands folded in her lap. I think they showed whatever Armstrong and Aldrin saw on that ridge. I think someone at NASA or the Pentagon decided those images were too sensitive to remain in the public archive, so they removed them and pretended they never existed. Marcus felt the pieces starting to come together, but he still needed more. Did you ever hear anything else? Rumours? Gossip? Anything about what might have been on those photos? Clayne hesitated, then nodded slowly. There was an old technician, worked in photo processing during the Apollo era. He retired in the late 80s. We used to have lunch sometimes, talk shop. One day, after a few drinks, he told me about a special project he'd worked on. He called it the clean-up detail. Clean-up? His job was to retouch lunar surface photos before they were released to the public. NASA claimed it was just to enhance clarity, improve contrast, make the images more suitable for publication, but he said they were removing things. Shadows that didn't match the terrain, reflections that couldn't be explained, dark silhouettes on distant horizons. Marcus's mind was racing. Did he say specifically what they were removing? He wouldn't give details, but he did say one thing I've never forgotten. He said the moon wasn't empty when we got there. He said it was never empty. Part 6. The Astronaut's Silence. Michael Collins, the third member of the Apollo 11 crew, orbited the moon alone in the command module Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin made history on the surface below. Every public account emphasized his isolation. The loneliest man in the universe, they called him, cut off from all human contact during his passes around the moon's far side. But according to Hale's documents, Collins made his own disturbing observations during those solitary orbits. Marcus tracked down a former NASA public affairs officer who'd worked with Collins during post-mission appearances. The man, who insisted on anonymity, agreed to meet at a bar in Clear Lake, Texas, not far from the Johnson Space Center. Collins was different after Apollo 11, the former officer said, nursing a beer and keeping his voice low despite the noise of the sports bar around them. Armstrong and Aldrin got all the attention, obviously, but Collins was the one who seemed most affected by the experience. He did the appearances, the tours, the press conferences, but there was something in his eyes, like he'd seen something that changed him. Did he ever talk about it? Marcus asked. Not publicly, but there were private moments. I travelled with him for 2 years after the mission, helping coordinate media appearances. One night we're in a hotel in Tokyo, both of us jet-lagged, sitting in the bar at 3 a.m. He's had a few drinks, more than usual, and he starts talking about the far side of the moon. Marcus leaned closer. What did he say? He said being on the far side was strange. Total radio silence from Earth, from Houston, from the lunar module. Just him and the cosmos. He said that's when he saw it. Saw what? The former officer took a long drink before answering. A light, moving alongside Columbia. At first he thought it was debris, part of the spacecraft, or maybe something from the lunar module, but it paced him, matched his orbital velocity perfectly, stayed at a constant distance. He watched it for 3 complete orbits. Then, right as he was about to come back around to the near side, it accelerated and disappeared. Did he report it? He said he did, on the private channel once he re-established contact with Houston. They told him it was probably space junk or an optical illusion from the sun reflecting off particles. But Collins didn't buy it. He said he knew what space debris looked like, and this wasn't it. This was deliberate. This was something watching him. Marcus felt his excitement building. Is there any record of this report? The former officer shook his head. If there is, it's buried deep. Collins never mentioned it publicly. But here's the thing. I wasn't the only one he told. There were others over the years. People he trusted. We all signed NDAs, promised never to discuss conversations we had with the astronauts. But I figure after 50-some years, and with you already digging into this, maybe it's time. Back in his hotel room that night, Marcus reviewed everything he'd gathered so far. Hale's testimony about the transmission blackout and the helmet camera feed. Klein's evidence of missing photographs and image manipulation. Now Collins's unreported sighting in lunar orbit. The pattern was becoming clear. Multiple independent sources all pointing to the same conclusion. Something happened during Apollo 11 that was deliberately concealed from the public. But he still needed the smoking gun. He needed direct testimony from one of the astronauts themselves. That's when he remembered Hale mentioning Buzz Aldrin. Part 7. The Aldrin Interview. Buzz Aldrin was the second human to walk on the moon, and over the decades since Apollo 11, he'd become known for his candour, his willingness to speak about his experiences and struggles. He'd discussed his battles with depression and alcoholism, his frustrations with NASA, bureaucracy, his thoughts on the future of space exploration. And on a few notable occasions he'd hinted at something unusual during the Apollo 11 mission. Marcus found a reference to a 1996 interview that Aldrin had done with a small aerospace magazine. The interview had never been published, supposedly due to editorial disagreements. But the journalist who conducted it, a woman named Patricia Hammond, was still alive and working as a freelance writer in Florida. When Marcus called her, Hammond's response was immediate and defensive. "I don't talk about that interview. I signed an agreement." "With NASA?" Marcus asked. "With lawyers representing NASA. They made it very clear that certain portions of my conversation with Aldrin were not suitable for publication. They compensated me for my time and my silence." "But you still have the recording?" A long pause. Then quietly, "Maybe." It took 3 more phone calls, a promise to keep her name out of any publication, and a wire transfer of $5,000 before Hammond agreed to send Marcus a digital copy of the suppressed portion of the interview. What he heard made his hands shake. The interview audio was scratchy, clearly recorded on older equipment, but the voices were clear. Hammond asking questions, Aldrin answering thoughtfully, until she asked about the famous UFO sighting during Apollo 11. In public statements over the years, Aldrin had acknowledged seeing something unusual during the flight to the moon, but always with caveats. It was probably a panel from the spacecraft separation. It could have been debris, nothing definitive. But in this unpublished interview, his tone was different. "Hammond, there's been a lot of speculation about what you saw on the way to the moon. Can you describe it?" Aldrin, "We saw something. All 3 of us. It was following us, maintaining distance. It wasn't debris, because debris doesn't maintain formation. It wasn't the Saturn IV panel, because we could see that tumbling away in a different direction." Hammond, "What did it look like?" Aldrin, "Cylindrical. Metallic. When the sun hit it at certain angles, it was brilliant. Other times it was dark, almost invisible. We reported it to Houston on a private channel." Hammond, "And what did Houston say?" Aldrin, "They told us not to discuss it publicly. They said it would cause unnecessary panic. But that wasn't the strangest part." Hammond, "What was the strangest part?" Aldrin, long pause. "When we landed on the moon, there were 3 more of them, on the ridge, just like the one that followed us. Same shape, same size, like they were waiting." Hammond, "You reported this as well?" Aldrin, "Of course. Neil did, immediately. That's when they cut the public feed and put us on the encrypted channel. They didn't want the world to hear what we were describing." Hammond, "What did you describe?" Aldrin, "Structures, technology, something that definitely wasn't human. We were told very clearly that this information was classified under national security protocols. We were told that discussing it could jeopardize not just the space program, but national security itself." Hammond, "And you've kept quiet all these years?" Aldrin, "What choice did I have? You think I wanted to be labelled a crackpot? You think I wanted to spend the rest of my life being questioned about little green men? But I'll tell you this, what we saw was real. It was there. And someone needs to find out what it was and why we were told to stay silent. The recording ended there. According to Hammond, that's when Aldrin's publicist had intervened, ended the interview, and initiated the legal process to suppress the recording. Marcus listened to it 5 more times, making detailed notes. This was it. Direct testimony from one of the Apollo 11 astronauts, on record, describing exactly what Hale had claimed, the structures on the ridge, the encrypted communication channel, the directive to remain silent, but he still needed to know what happened next. What did NASA do with this information? Where did it go? The answer, according to Hale, lay in a classified debriefing that took place 8 days after the astronauts returned to Earth. Part 8. The Secret Debriefing. On July 28, 1969, the Apollo 11 crew underwent their official mission debrief at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. The public version of this debrief covered technical aspects of the flight, equipment performance, scientific observations and recommendations for future missions. The transcript runs to hundreds of pages and has been publicly available for decades. But according to documents Hale provided, there was a second classified debriefing that same day. This one took place in a secure conference room with only select personnel present. No press, no public record. And according to a fragmentary transcript Hale had managed to preserve, the discussion was explosive. The partial transcript Marcus received was heavily redacted, but enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. Classified Debriefing, Apollo 11. Crew date, July 28, 1969. Location, Building 30, Manned Spacecraft Center. Present, redacted, N. Armstrong, E. Aldrin, M. Collins, redacted. Redacted. Gentlemen, this session is classified top secret. Nothing discussed here leaves this room. Is that understood? Armstrong. Understood. Redacted. Commander Armstrong, please describe in detail what you observed at 11:01 Eastern Time on July 20th. Armstrong. After exiting the LM and conducting initial surface assessment, I observed 3 cylindrical objects on a ridge approximately 0.8 kilometers from our position. The objects were metallic in appearance. Vertical orientation, approximately, redacted. Size estimate, Armstrong. Difficult to gauge at that distance, but estimated between 40 and 60 feet in height. They were arranged in a linear pattern, evenly spaced, redacted. Movement, Armstrong. The centre object appeared to rotate slowly. The rotation was observable due to a reflective surface that caught sunlight intermittently. I observed this for approximately 90 seconds before Houston requested channel switch, redacted. Colonel Aldrin, did you observe these objects as well? Aldrin, yes. When I exited the LM approximately 20 minutes later, I looked toward the ridge Armstrong had described. The objects were still visible. I observed what appeared to be independent illumination, a glow that wasn't consistent with solar reflection. Collins, I'd like to add something. Redacted. Go ahead. Collins. During my solo orbits, I observed a similar object maintaining position relative to Columbia. This was consistent across multiple orbits. The object matched our velocity and altitude precisely. When I reported this, I was instructed to... The transcript cuts off here. The remainder of the document was missing, but Hale had provided context in his notes. According to him, the debriefing had concluded with explicit instructions to the crew. They were to maintain absolute silence about their observations. They were told that investigation into the phenomena was ongoing at the highest levels of government, and that premature disclosure could compromise both national security and the space program itself. The astronauts had complied. For 50 years they'd carried the secret. But the government's investigation, according to Hale, had continued in the shadows. Part 9. The Pentagon Connection. The Defense Intelligence Agency had maintained close oversight of the Apollo program from its inception. While NASA was a civilian agency, the military implications of space exploration were obvious. Reconnaissance, communications, potential weapons platforms, all of these fell within DoD's purview. So when Apollo 11 reported anomalous objects on the lunar surface, it was the DIA that took the lead in analysing the implications. Marcus managed to track down a former DIA analyst who'd worked on aerospace intelligence during the late 1960s. The man, who insisted on using only the pseudonym Thomas, agreed to speak on condition of complete anonymity. The Apollo 11 findings triggered a complete reassessment of our understanding of the lunar environment, Thomas said during their secure video call. We'd been sending probes to the moon since the early 60s, Ranger, Surveyor, Lunar Orbiter. None of them had detected anything unusual. No structures, no anomalies. So when the Apollo crew reported what they saw, the initial reaction was skepticism. But they investigated, Marcus asked. Extensively. We pulled every photograph, every piece of telemetry data, every communication transcript. We analysed sun angles, shadow patterns, optical illusions. We even considered the possibility that the crew was hallucinating, some kind of psychological break from the stress of the mission. But you couldn't explain it away. Thomas was silent for a long moment. No, the evidence was too consistent. 3 trained observers, all reporting the same phenomena independently. Visual confirmation from multiple angles. And then there were the photographs. The missing photographs from the archive, Marcus prompted. Those photos weren't missing. They were moved, classified. I saw some of them during the initial analysis. They showed exactly what the crew described. Cylindrical structures, geometric precision, surface composition inconsistent with natural lunar formations. So what did you conclude? Officially? The analysis was inconclusive. We couldn't definitively prove the objects were artificial, so we couldn't justify public disclosure. Unofficially, every analyst who saw that data knew we were looking at something that didn't belong there, something that predated our arrival. Alien technology? Thomas laughed bitterly. That's the obvious conclusion, isn't it? But here's the thing that bothered us most. The objects weren't ancient. They weren't covered in lunar dust. They weren't degraded by micrometeorite impacts or radiation. They looked new, which meant either they were recently placed there, or they were maintained somehow. That's terrifying. It gets worse. We analysed the trajectory of the object Collins reported shadowing the command module. Based on its behaviour, matching orbital velocity, maintaining precise distance, it would have required sophisticated propulsion and guidance systems, more sophisticated than anything we had at the time, maybe more sophisticated than anything we have now. Marcus felt a chill run through him. So what happened? Where did the investigation go from there? Above my pay grade, Thomas said. The analysis was kicked up to a special projects division. I heard rumours it was folded into a broader programme studying unexplained aerial phenomena, what we called UAPs, but the specifics were compartmentalised, need to know only, and I didn't need to know. Do you think we went back, secretly? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We had 6 more Apollo missions after 11. 5 of them successfully landed on the moon. If I were running the programme, I would have absolutely sent crews to investigate those structures, get closer, get better images, maybe even attempt contact. But whether that actually happened, I have no idea. The conversation left Marcus with more questions than answers, but it confirmed a crucial point. The Pentagon had taken the Apollo 11 observations seriously enough to launch a classified investigation, which meant the government believed something real had been detected on the moon. Now he needed to know what they found. Part 10. The Photo Laboratory. Following a lead from Rosa Klein, Marcus travelled to the former, site of Building 8 at the Manned Spacecraft Center, now the Johnson Space Center. The building no longer existed, demolished in the early 2000s during a facilities modernization project. But Klein had given him a name, Victor Reeves, a former photo technician who'd worked in Building 8 during the Apollo era. Reeves was 79 years old and living in a retirement community in Arizona. When Marcus called, the old man's voice was surprisingly strong and clear. "Building 8, Reeves said with a dry chuckle. "Haven't thought about that place in years. What's your interest?" Marcus explained his investigation, mentioning Hale's claims about photo manipulation and Klein's discovery of missing images. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then, I wondered when someone would finally start asking the right questions. Yeah, I worked the photo lab in Building 8 from 67 to 73. And yeah, we did cleanup work on Apollo images. Lots of it. Can you describe what that involved? Officially, we were enhancing image quality, adjusting contrast, sharpening details, removing artifacts from the development process, and we did do that work. But there was another project. Smaller team, higher security clearance. We called it the Anomaly Review, which involved taking lunar surface photographs and removing anything that didn't fit the expected profile. And before you ask, yes, that included things that appeared artificial, geometric shapes, reflective surfaces where there shouldn't be reflections, shadows that didn't match the sun angle. We'd airbrush them out, retouch the surrounding terrain to make it look natural. How many photos are we talking about? From Apollo 11 specifically, maybe 20, 25 images, but it continued through the other missions. By the end of the Apollo program, we'd cleaned up hundreds of photos. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Did you keep any of the originals? Before the retouching? Reeves laughed. Are you kidding? Everything was tracked. Every original, every work print, every final version. They ran inventory checks weekly. Taking anything out of that lab would have been instant dismissal and probably criminal charges. So there's no way to see what was removed? I didn't say that. Reeves paused. Look, I was young, curious, and I had access to a camera. I may have photographed a few work prints before we retouched them. Just for my own records, you understand. Nothing official. Marcus could barely breathe. You still have those photographs? Maybe. They're old, faded. Been sitting in a box in my garage for 50 years. But if you want to come out to Arizona, I suppose I could dig them out. 2 days later, Marcus was sitting in Reeves's small garage, looking at faded Polaroid images that showed the lunar surface before NASA's cleanup crew got to work. The images were exactly as Reeves had described. Angular shadows that didn't match the terrain, bright. Reflections from areas that should have been in darkness. And in 3 photos, clear geometric shapes on distant ridges. One image in particular made Marcus's hand shake. It showed the horizon beyond the Apollo 11 landing site, and there, unmistakably, were 3 vertical structures arranged in a line. The resolution wasn't good enough to show fine details, but the basic shapes were clear. Cylindrical, metallic, utterly inconsistent with natural geology. That's what you were looking for, isn't it? Reeves said quietly. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Keep it, Reeves said. I'm too old to care about NDAs anymore. If someone wants to prosecute an 80-year-old man for showing you a 50-year-old photo, let them try. The world deserves to know the truth. Part 11. Armstrong's Warning. The deeper Marcus dug into the Apollo 11 cover-up, the more he understood why the astronauts had remained silent for so long. The pressure applied to them hadn't just been bureaucratic or legal. It had been personal and intense. He found evidence of this in an unexpected place. The private papers of a former NASA administrator that had been donated to a university archive. Buried in routine correspondence from the 1970s was a memo from a DA liaison to NASA leadership, marked Eyes Only. The memo, dated April 3, 1970, outlined recommended protocols for managing astronaut testimony regarding classified mission observations. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was clear. Astronauts who discussed their observations publicly would face administrative consequences, including loss of flight status, pension review, and potential criminal prosecution under espionage laws. But there was one instance where the pressure had almost broken. Marcus discovered this through an interview with the widow of a former NASA public affairs officer. Her husband had died in 2008, but she remembered a story he'd told her about Neil Armstrong at a White House event in 1985. My husband said Armstrong had been drinking more than usual that night, she recalled. There was a small reception after the main event, just a few dozen people. Armstrong was talking with some aerospace contractors, and my husband overheard him say something strange. He said, "We were warned away. They didn't want us there." "Warned by who?" Marcus asked. That's what my husband asked, but Armstrong just shook his head and walked away. The next day, my husband got a call from Armstrong's assistant, asking if he'd overheard anything unusual at the reception. When my husband asked why, the assistant said Armstrong had been under stress and may have made some inappropriate comments. They wanted to make sure nothing made it into the media. Did your husband report what he heard? Not officially, but he told me he always wondered what Armstrong meant, warned away by who and why. The answer might have come from another source, a colleague of Armstrong's from his test pilot days who'd stayed in touch over the decades. The man, who asked not to be named, told Marcus about a conversation he'd had with Armstrong in the late 1990s. Neil was different after Apollo 11, the former pilot said. Quieter, more withdrawn. He did his public duties, but you could tell his heart wasn't in it. One day I asked him point blank, I said, "Neil, what really happened up there?" And he just looked at me with these tired eyes and said, "Some things are bigger than one man's conscience." What did he mean by that? I think he meant that he knew things the world should probably know, but that revealing them would cause more harm than good, or at least that's what he'd been convinced of. Part 12. The Final Evidence. Ernest Hale died on a Tuesday morning in late October, 4 months after his first meeting with Marcus. The cancer had progressed faster than the doctors predicted. But before he died, he made one final arrangement. Marcus received a package from Hale's attorney 3 days after the funeral. Inside was a small aluminum case, the kind used for storing film reels, and a handwritten note. "Marcus, if you're reading this, I've run out of time. Inside this case is the most important piece of evidence I managed to save. I've kept it hidden for 50 years, moving it from one secure location to another, always afraid someone would find it and destroy it. Now it's yours. Use it wisely. The truth matters more than my reputation or my legacy. Ernest." Inside the aluminum case was a 16mm film reel, carefully sealed in archival plastic. A label on the reel read, "Apollo 11, EVA restricted, do not duplicate." Marcus's hands trembled as he carefully removed the reel. He'd anticipated this moment, prepared for it by locating a restoration specialist who could safely digitize old film stock. 2 days later, he sat in the specialist's darkened studio and watched the film play on a modern screen. The footage was grainy, occasionally jumping and flickering with age, but it was unmistakably from the lunar surface. The perspective was from Armstrong's helmet camera, the same feed Hale had described seeing in the communications room. The timestamp in the corner showed 11:02 post-meridian Eastern Time, July 20th, 1969. The camera panned across the lunar landscape, grey regolith stretching to a sharp horizon against the black sky. Then the view shifted, focusing on a distant ridge. The image was shaky, affected by Armstrong's breathing and movement, but there was no mistaking what appeared in frame. 3 cylindrical structures, exactly as described in all the testimonies Marcus had gathered. They were metallic, catching the harsh sunlight and casting precise geometric shadows on the lunar surface. The centre structure appeared to be rotating slowly, its surface reflecting light in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic. Then the audio kicked in, scratchy and broken but audible. A voice, Armstrong's, tight with tension. "Houston, do you copy this feed?" Static, then another voice from Houston. "We copy, Eagle. Maintain visual contact." Armstrong again. "It's moving, the centre one, it's rotating toward my position." Another voice, Aldrin's, in the background. "Neil, it's tracking you, it's definitely tracking you." Houston. "Stand by, Eagle, we're analysing." The camera continued to focus on the structures for another 30 seconds. Then, suddenly, the centre structure seemed to flare with light, a brilliant reflection that washed out the camera for several frames. When the image cleared, the camera was pointed at the ground. Armstrong's breathing was audible, rapid and shallow. Houston. "Eagle, redirect to surface sample collection. Acknowledge." Armstrong. "Acknowledged." The footage ran for another 10 seconds, showing only lunar soil, then cut to black. Marcus watched the film 6 times in total, making detailed notes, capturing screenshots, ensuring he had documented every frame. This was it. Physical evidence of exactly what Hale, Aldrin, and the others had described. It wasn't proof of alien life, but it was undeniable proof that something anomalous had been present on the moon during Apollo 11, and that NASA had deliberately concealed it. But as Marcus prepared to publish his findings, as he compiled all the evidence he'd gathered over 6 months of intensive investigation, something happened that changed everything. Part 13, The Message. The email arrived at 3:37 in the morning, jolting Marcus awake with its notification chime. The sender was listed as Concerned Observer, and the subject line read, "Before you publish." Marcus opened it with growing dread. "Marcus Webb, we know what you found. We know about Hale's testimony, Klein's documents, the Aldrin interview and the film. We've been watching your investigation with interest. Before you make the decision to release this information publicly, you should know something that Ernest Hale didn't. You should know what Apollo 12 found at the Ocean of Storms." The email included a single attachment, a PDF file with a simple title, Surveyor 3 Recovery Mission, Classified Addendum. Apollo 12 had landed on the moon in November 1969, just 4 months after Apollo 11. One of its mission objectives was to reach the Surveyor 3 probe, an unmanned lander that had touched down in April 1967. The astronauts successfully retrieved parts of Surveyor 3, bringing them back to Earth for analysis. That was the public story. The classified addendum told a very different tale. According to the document, when the Apollo 12 crew reached Surveyor 3, they found something unexpected. The probe had been moved, not by much, perhaps 15 feet from its original landing site, but it had definitely been relocated deliberately, carefully, and then set down in a new position. More disturbing, Surveyor 3's camera, which had been pointed west in all the original mission images from '67, was now pointed northeast, toward a series of geometric formations that hadn't been visible in the original photographs. The Apollo 12 crew had photographed these formations extensively, and the classified addendum included several of those images. They showed structures similar to what Armstrong and Aldrin had seen, cylindrical objects arranged in patterns, some partially buried in lunar regolith, others standing free. But there was one crucial difference. These structures appeared older, weathered, covered in the fine dust that accumulates on the lunar surface over time. The document concluded with a chilling assessment. Evidence suggests long-term presence of non-terrestrial technology on the lunar surface. Origin, purpose, and current operational status remain unknown. Recommend continued classified investigation and absolute suppression of public disclosure, pending comprehensive threat assessment. The email's message continued below the attachment. "This is just the beginning, Marcus. Apollo 14 found more. Apollo 15 made contact. Apollo 16 was warned to leave. Apollo 17 discovered why. If you release what you know about Apollo 11, we will be forced to release the complete record. Are you prepared for the world to know everything? Think carefully about what you're about to do." The email ended with no signature, no contact information, no way to respond. Marcus sat in his dark apartment staring at the screen, his mind racing. The implication was clear. There was far more to the lunar cover-up than just Apollo 11. The evidence he'd gathered was just the tip of an iceberg that extended through the entire Apollo program and possibly beyond. If he published his Apollo 11 findings, whoever sent this email, presumably someone within the intelligence community, with access to the full classified record, would retaliate by releasing even more explosive information. Information about contact, about warnings, about discoveries that might fundamentally challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Was he ready for that? Was the world ready for that? He thought about Ernest Hale, who'd spent 50 years carrying the weight of this secret, dying with the hope that the truth would finally emerge. He thought about the astronauts who'd been silenced, threatened, forced to deny what they'd witnessed. He thought about the public's right to know, weighed against the potential chaos that full disclosure might unleash. As dawn broke over his apartment window, Marcus sat at his computer, his article complete and ready to publish. Everything he'd found, every interview, every document, the film footage, all of it compiled into a comprehensive expose that would change history. His finger hovered over the publish button. On his other screen, The email from Concerned Observer remained open, its threat hanging in the digital air like a sword. If you release what you know about Apollo 11, we will release the complete record. Marcus Webb had spent his entire career searching for the truth, exposing secrets, bringing hidden information into the light. But now, faced with the biggest story of his life, he found himself paralysed by a terrible question. What if some truths are too dangerous to tell? The cursor blinked on the screen. Publish. Don't publish. The choice that would define his legacy and possibly humanity's future. Outside, the sun rose over another ordinary day, in a world that had no idea what secrets lurked in the shadows of its greatest achievement. Marcus's finger remained frozen over the keyboard. The film reel sat in its aluminum case on his desk, 3 cylindrical structures captured forever on 16mm film, rotating slowly under an alien sun, watching, waiting, as they had been for 50 years. And somewhere in the classified archives of the United States government, the complete record of humanity's first contact waited in the darkness, neither confirmed nor denied, neither revealed nor forgotten, existing in that strange quantum state of truth that is simultaneously known and unknown, believed and doubted, terrifying and magnificent. The story of Apollo 11, the transmission they never released, remained balanced on the edge of revelation, as close to the light as it had ever been, and yet still shrouded in the same shadows that had concealed it since that July day in 1969, when 3 men looked up at structures on a lunar ridge and had their reality forever transformed. Marcus Webb stared at his screen, the weight of history pressing down on him, the future hanging in the balance, and the cursor blinked. Publish. Don't publish. The choice was his alone, but the truth, whatever it was, wherever it led, continued to exist independent of his decision, waiting in the lunar dust, patient and eternal, for the day when humanity would finally be ready to face what it had found among the stars.